The summer sun blazed mercilessly over Clearwater Station as Margaret Ellis sat abandoned in her wedding dress watching the train that should have carried her to happiness disappear into the shimmering heat. At 42, she'd been deemed too old by the groom who never showed his family's cruel message, still echoing in her ears. But fate had other plans. A weathered cowboy named Daniel Harper would change everything before sunset. Dear friends, settle in as I share this extraordinary tale of love found in the ashes of humiliation. And please comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The cicadas sang their relentless summer song as Daniel Harper guided his horse down the dusty main street of Clearwater, Texas. The year was 1885, and the August heat pressed down on the small frontier town like a heavy blanket, making even the shadows seem to sweat. Daniel's weathered hands gripped the reins with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs, but today those hands trembled slightly, not from the heat, but from the weight of memory. It had been exactly 2 years since Sarah died, 2 years since cholera had swept through their homestead like wildfire, taking his wife and their unborn child in the span of 3 horrific days. The anniversary always brought him to town, though he couldn't quite say why. Perhaps it was the need to be around people, even strangers, on the day when solitude threatened to swallow him whole. "Morning, Daniel," called out Sam Morrison from the general store porch, tipping his hat. "Hot enough to fry eggs on the sidewalk today." Daniel touched the brim of his own hat in response, but didn't slow his horse. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, not today. The familiar weight of his Colt 45 rested against his hip, a reminder of the dangerous times they lived in, though danger seemed preferable to the crushing mundanity of grief. As he approached the train station at the end of Main Street, something unusual caught his eye. A woman sat alone on the platform bench, dressed in what appeared to be a wedding dress, ivory silk, that had seen better days, now dulled with dust and perspiration. She was perfectly still, like a statue someone had forgotten to unveil, her hands folded in her lap with such rigid precision that Daniel wondered if she was even breathing. He'd planned to ride past to continue to the feed store for the supplies that had ostensibly brought him to town, but something about her stillness, her isolation in that moment, pulled at something deep within him. He'd seen that particular brand of devastation before in his own reflection during those first terrible months after Sarah's death. Daniel dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post near the station. The platform was nearly empty, save for old Pete, the station master, who was pretending to sweep the already clean boards while stealing glances at the woman. A small cluster of townswomen had gathered near the ticket window, their whispers carrying on the hot breeze like tumbleweeds. Ici, left at the altar, can you imagine? 42 years old, what did she expect? Family sent word she was too old to marry their boy. Daniel's jaw tightened. He'd never had much patience for gossip, less so when it kicked someone already down. He climbed the platform steps, his spurs jangling with each step, and the whispers died away as the women noticed his approach. The woman in the wedding dress didn't look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the empty railroad tracks stretching endlessly toward the horizon, as if sheer will might conjure the train that had already departed. Up close, Daniel could see the fine lines around her eyes, the threads of silver in her dark hair that had been carefully pinned up with pearl combs. Probably family heirlooms, he thought, noticing their aged patina. "Ma'am," he said softly, removing his hat. She startled slightly, as if pulled from a deep reverie, and turned to look at him. Her eyes were the color of prairie grass after rain, green with flecks of gold, and they held a depth of pain that made Daniel's chest constrict. But there was something else there too, a fierce dignity that refused to be extinguished despite whatever humiliation she'd endured. "Sir," she responded, her voice cultured and steady despite everything. "Boston, maybe? Or Philadelphia, definitely not local. Mind if I sit?" She gestured to the empty space beside her with a slight incline of her head. "The bench belongs to the Texas and Pacific Railway Company, I believe. I have no authority to grant or deny you anything." Despite himself, Daniel felt the corner of his mouth twitch. There was steel in this woman, hidden beneath the silk and lace. He sat down, keeping a respectful distance, and for a moment they both stared at the empty tracks. "Daniel Harper," he said finally, "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here." "Margaret Ellis, boss?" she replied, then added with bitter irony, Recently of Boston, and as of this morning, permanently of nowhere in particular. That's a long way from Boston. Indeed. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt, though not nearly as long as the journey from hope to humiliation, which I've discovered can be traversed in the span of a single telegram. Daniel pulled out his worn Bible from his jacket pocket, Sarah's Bible actually, though he'd carried it as his own these past 2 years. Would you mind reading something for me? My eyes aren't what they used to be in this bright light. It was a transparent lie. Daniel's eyesight was sharp enough to spot a rattlesnake at 50 paces, but Margaret seemed to understand the kindness behind it. She took the Bible with hands that trembled only slightly and opened it to where his thumb had marked the page. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. She read from the book of Job, her voice gaining strength with each word. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. That's always been a favorite of mine, Daniel said quietly. Sometimes trust is all we got when everything else gets stripped away. Margaret closed the Bible carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Your wife's? She asked, noticing the name Sarah Harper, embossed in fading gold letters. Was. The word came out rougher than intended. Cholera 2 years ago today. I'm sorry. She handed the Bible back, and their fingers brushed briefly the first human touch either had experienced in longer than they cared to admit. Loss leaves such peculiar scars, doesn't it? Invisible to others, but we carry them like stones in our chest. That it does. Daniel tucked the Bible away. You lose someone too, besides today, I mean. Margaret's laugh was short and bitter. My parents years ago, my brother in the war, my fiancé, my first fiancé to consumption 5 years past. I came west because Charles today's prospective groom promised a new beginning. His letters were so eloquent, so full of promise. She gestured to her dress. I spent the last of my savings on this dress and the train fare. Rather foolish for a woman of my age and circumstances, wouldn't you say? I'd say hope ain't never foolish no matter how old we get. She turned to study him, then really look at him. Daniel Harper was perhaps 45, with deep lines carved by sun and sorrow around his eyes. His face was lean and weathered like old leather, but there was a kindness in his gray eyes that seemed at odds with the hard life etched into his features. His clothes were clean, but worn, the pants patched at the knees, the jacket frayed at the cuffs. A working man not wealthy, but one who took care with what he had. Mr. Harper, she said slowly, why did you really stop to talk to me? Surely you have business to attend to. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Because I recognize the look, he said finally. That particular way a person sits when they're trying to decide whether to keep going or just stop. Sat like that myself plenty of times these past 2 years. And what made you keep going? Stubbornness mostly. That and the animals needed feeding. He paused. What's going to make you keep going? Margaret considered this. I honestly don't know. I have $17 to my name, no family, no prospects, and apparently I'm too old to be a bride, but too young to peacefully fade into spinsterhood. Charles Whitmore, wasn't it? Daniel asked. The merchant's son. You know him. Know of him. Boy's 30 if he's a day still lives with his mama and couldn't rope a fence post if it was standing still. You didn't miss much. This startled a genuine laugh from Margaret, the first real emotion besides despair she'd shown. That's terribly unkind, Mr. Harper. Maybe, but it's also true. His mother's been running his life since he was in short pants. Probably took one look at your picture and decided you were too much woman for her boy to handle. Too much woman? Margaret repeated wonderingly. That's certainly one way to describe being past one's prime. Prime for what? You talk proper. You can read. You made it all the way from Boston on your own, and you're sitting here with your back straight, even though your world just fell apart. Where I come from, that's called character, not past prime. Pete the station master had given up all pretense of sweeping and was openly gawking now along with half the town, it seemed. Word traveled fast in Clearwater, and Margaret Ellis's humiliation was the most exciting thing to happen since the last cattle drive came through. "They're all watching," Margaret murmured, becoming aware of their audience. "Let 'em watch," Daniel said. "Folk around here need more to occupy their minds anyway." Just then, Mrs. Prudence Blackwood, the mayor's wife and Clearwater's self-appointed moral guardian, approached with two other women flanking her like lieutenants. Her dress was impeccable, despite the heat, her posture suggesting she had a ramrod for a spine. "Miss Ellis," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy, "how absolutely dreadful for you. Mr. Whitmore sent word that there had been a terrible misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," Margaret repeated flatly. "Yes, apparently there was some confusion about your circumstances. He was under the impression you were considerably younger." "I never lied about my age, Mrs. Blackwood. Every letter I sent was truthful." "Oh, I'm sure, dear. But you must understand a man has certain expectations when seeking a bride. At your age, well—" She trailed off delicately, as if Margaret's advanced years were a communicable disease. "The Ladies' Aid Society would be happy to help arrange transportation back east. We could take up a collection." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "That's very kind, but unnecessary." "But surely you don't intend to stay. I mean, what would you do here?" "She could teach," Daniel interjected, suddenly surprising himself as much as anyone. "Town's been needing a school teacher since Mrs. Patterson left." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as she noticed Daniel properly for the first time. "Mr. Harper, I didn't realize you were acquainted with Miss Ellis." "We're getting acquainted right now," he said mildly, "and seems to me a woman educated enough to correspond from Boston might be exactly what Clearwater's children need. The position requires references, a proper moral standing, and what's more moral than a woman who keeps her dignity when the world's trying to strip it away?" Daniel's voice had taken on an edge that made Mrs. Blackwood step back slightly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the small group. Margaret looked between Daniel and Mrs. Blackwood, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Well," Mrs. Blackwood huffed, "I suppose we'll let the school board decide such matters. Good day, Miss Ellis. Mr. Harper." She swept away with her entourage whispers, already flying between them like angry bees. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said once they were gone. "Maybe not, but Prudence Blackwood's been needing someone to stand up to her for years. Woman thinks she owns the town because her husband's the mayor. Still, defending a stranger could hurt your standing in the community." Daniel shrugged. "My standing's been rocky since Sarah died anyway. Folks don't quite know what to do with a man who keeps to himself and doesn't come to church regular anymore. You've lost your faith. More like misplaced it. Keep checking the places I left it, but it hasn't turned up yet." He stood stretching muscles stiff from sitting. "You have a place to stay tonight." Margaret shook her head. "I had assumed—" "Well, it doesn't matter what I assumed. Mrs. Chen runs a boarding house on 2nd Street. Clean, respectable, and she doesn't gossip. Tell her I sent you and she'll give you a fair rate." "That's kind of you, Mr. Harper, but I should preserve what little money I have." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small roll of bills. "Consider it a loan against your first month's teaching salary." "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. Town does need a teacher, and you need work. Seems like a solution presenting itself." Margaret stood as well, facing him fully. They were nearly the same height, and she could see the flecks of silver in his stubble, the weariness that matched her own. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I could be a confidence woman, a fraud, anything." "Are you—" "No." "Then that's settled." He handed her the money, closing her fingers around it when she hesitated. Sarah would have done the same. She had a way of seeing people who needed help and just helping. No questions, no judgment. I haven't been able to do much of anything the way she would have wanted these past 2 years, but maybe I can start with this. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Teaching Clearwater's children might make you regret staying. Tommy Morrison alone is enough to drive a saint to drink, and the Hendricks twins aren't far behind." Despite everything, Margaret smiled. "I taught at a factory school in Boston, Mr. Harper. I suspect I can handle a few frontier children. We'll see about that." He put his hat back on, tipping it to her. The school board meets Thursday evenings at the town hall. I'll put in a word. You have that much influence. No, but my ranch supplies beef to half the county, including most of the school board members. That counts for something. He started to leave, then turned back. Miss Ellis Margaret, don't let today define you. Sometimes the worst moments just clear the path for something better. She watched him walk away, his gait steady and purposeful, despite the slight favor of his left leg she hadn't noticed before. An old injury, perhaps, or just the toll of hard living. When he reached his horse, he looked back at her once more, touching his hat brim in farewell. Margaret sat back down on the bench, but something had shifted. The weight in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it had rearranged itself somehow. She looked down at the money in her hand, $20 more than her entire savings, a fortune for a stranger to trust her with. The train whistle sounded in the distance, the 2:15 from Fort Worth approaching. She could use Daniel Harper's money to buy a ticket back east, disappear into the familiar misery of factory work and boarding houses. It would be the sensible thing, the expected thing. But Margaret Ellis had done the expected thing her whole life, and where had it gotten her? Abandoned on a train platform, in a wedding dress she couldn't afford, humiliated, and alone at 42. Perhaps it was time to try the unexpected. She stood gathering her small valise and what remained of her dignity, and walked toward 2nd Street. Behind her, she heard Pete finally resume his sweeping and the whispers start up again. Let them whisper, she thought, echoing Daniel's earlier sentiment. By Thursday, they'd have something new to talk about. The afternoon sun was brutal as she made her way through town, her wedding dress drawing stares from everyone she passed. Some were pitying, others curious, a few openly mocking. But Margaret kept her head high, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Each step took her further from the train station and the woman who'd been prepared to surrender. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building painted a cheerful yellow that had faded to the color of old butter. A sign in the window advertised, "Clean rooms, hot meals, no questions." The last part made Margaret suspect Daniel Harper knew exactly what he was doing when he recommended this place. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a tiny Chinese woman with silver-streaked black hair and knowing eyes. "You are Miss Ellis," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you Mr. Harper was here 5 minutes ago. Paid for a week in advance, said you might be too proud to use all his money at once." Mrs. Chen stepped aside. "Come. You need tea and different clothes. Wedding dress is bad luck when there's no wedding." Margaret followed her inside the blessed coolness of the interior, making her suddenly aware of how overheated she'd become. The boarding house was immaculately clean with simple but well-maintained furniture and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. "You know Mr. Harper well?" Margaret asked as Mrs. Chen led her upstairs. "2 years I know him. He brought his wife here when she got sick, thought town doctor might help more than he could alone. I helped nurse her those last days." She opened a door to reveal a small but pleasant room with a window overlooking the back garden. "He's a good man. Broken, but good." "Aren't we all broken in some way?" Mrs. Chen studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Yes. But some people break like cheap china, sharp edges everywhere, dangerous to touch. Others break like good iron, can be reforged if the fire's hot enough." She moved to a wardrobe and pulled out a simple blue calico dress. This should fit, belonged to another woman who left it behind, running to or from something I never asked. Margaret accepted the dress gratefully. "Thank you. I'll wash and return it as soon as I can afford." Is gift. Wedding dress you can sell to Mrs. Morrison at the general store. She buys fancy fabric, makes other things from it. Should get enough to buy 2 or 3 regular dresses. The practicality of it struck Margaret as both sad and liberating. That dress had represented so much hope, so much foolish dreaming. But if it could be transformed into something useful, perhaps that was better than keeping it as a monument to humiliation. Mrs. Chen left her to change, and Margaret carefully removed the wedding dress, folding it with more care than it probably deserved. The blue calico was soft from many washings and fit reasonably well. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the Boston spinster trying desperately to be a frontier bride. In her place stood, she wasn't sure what, A woman in transition, perhaps? Neither here nor there, but no longer frozen on that terrible bench. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Supper in 10 minutes, Mrs. Chen called. "You eat with me in kitchen. Other boarders eat in dining room. Too many questions out there tonight." Margaret could have kissed the woman for her thoughtfulness. She wasn't ready to face curious strangers over a meal, to have to explain her presence and her circumstances. Tomorrow would be soon enough for that. The kitchen was warm and filled with steam from the stove, but comfortable in a way that reminded Margaret of her mother's kitchen long ago. Mrs. Chen served a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and some kind of spiced meat Margaret couldn't identify, but found delicious. "You really planning to teach school?" Mrs. Chen asked between bites. "If they'll have me. I have experience, though I suspect Boston factory children might be different from frontier ones. Children are children everywhere, need same things, firm hand, soft heart, and eyes and back of head." Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time, transforming her stern face. "You have that last one, I think. Saw how you watched Mrs. Blackwood and her chickens. You knew what they were about before they opened mouths. She seems formidable." "She's scared," Mrs. Chen corrected. "Scared of anything different, anything that might upset her perfect little world. You're different. That makes you dangerous." "I hardly feel dangerous. I feel like a fool who spent her last penny on a dream that turned into a nightmare." "Nightmare's not over if you're still breathing. Could still become different dream." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of chopsticks Mrs. Chen and fork Margaret against ceramic bowls. Finally, Margaret asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Mr. Harper seems very, solitary. Has he been alone these whole 2 years?" "Alone, yes. Lonely, also yes, though he'd die before admitting. Town widows have tried Mrs. Patterson. Before she left the widow Collins, even young Lucy Morrison when she came of age. He's polite but distant. Today, first time I see him really look at someone since Sarah died." "He was just being kind." Mrs. Chen made a sound that might have been a snort. "Daniel Harper is kind, yes, but not stupid. Doesn't throw money at lost causes. He saw something in you same as you saw something in him. I saw a grieving widower who understood loss. And he saw—" Margaret considered this. "I don't know. A fellow traveler in misery, perhaps." "Perhaps? Or perhaps he saw a woman strong enough to get on train alone, cross country alone, sit on platform in wedding dress alone without falling apart. That takes different kind of strength than most possess." Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Chen continued, "School board will want to test you. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history. You prepared?" "I believe so. I have a teaching certificate from Massachusetts." "Good. But they'll test anyway. Also test your morals, your bearing, whether you'll be appropriate influence on children." The sarcasm in her voice was subtle but present. "Mrs. Blackwood leads school board. She won't make easy." "Then why did Mr. Harper suggest it?" "Because Judge Patterson is on board too, and he's fair. So is Reverend Morrison, Sam's brother, not same politics. And Mayor Blackwood usually goes against his wife just to prove he can when others are watching." The complexity of small-town politics was something Margaret hadn't fully considered. In Boston, she'd been anonymous, just another cog in the great machine. Here, everything she did would be watched, weighed, judged. "I should prepare, boss," she said, rising from the table. "Would you happen to have any books I could review? It's been some months since I actively taught." "Have small library and parlor. Help yourself. Also, Mrs." Chen reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. This was Sarah Harper's. She was going to be teacher before she married. Made notes about what children here needed to learn. Daniel gave it to me after. Said he couldn't bear to keep, but couldn't bear to throw away. Margaret took the journal reverently. "I couldn't. This is too personal. It's practical. She's dead, you're alive, children need teaching. Sarah would understand. She was practical woman too under all that sweetness." The journal was filled with neat handwriting lesson plans, observations about individual children in town, notes about what materials were lacking and what could be improvised. It was like receiving a roadmap from beyond the grave, and Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. That night, she sat by the window in her small room, reading Sarah Harper's journal by lamplight. The The woman who emerged from the pages was intelligent, compassionate, creative in her approaches to education. She'd written about her husband 2 little mentions here and there. Daniel brought home slate pieces from the quarry, enough for all the children. D. Building new benches for schoolhouse says children shouldn't have to sit on floor. Worried about Daniel working too hard, but he says school is important as ranch. These glimpses of their life together brought tears to Margaret's eyes. The love between the lines was palpable, the partnership evident. No wonder Daniel Harper had been destroyed by her loss. To have that and lose it seemed worse somehow than never having it at all. Or did it? Margaret thought of her own losses, her parents, her brother, her first fiancé. Each had carved away a piece of her until she'd felt like a hollow shell going through the motions of living without really being alive. Perhaps that's what Daniel had recognized in her, that quality of existing, rather than living, that marked those who'd lost too much. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Ellis? You still awake?" Mrs. Chen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, come in." The older woman entered carrying a tea tray. "Thought you might need this. Helps with sleeping in new place." The tea was fragrant and soothing, some blend of herbs Margaret didn't recognize. They sat together in comfortable silence, Mrs. Chen in the single chair, Margaret on the bed. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said finally. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me any more than Mr. Harper does. When I came here 15 years ago, my husband had just died. Railroad accident. I had nothing, no English, no money, no friends. Sarah Harper found me crying behind the general store trying to decide whether to steal food or starve with honor." Mrs. Chen smiled at the memory. "She took me home, fed me, taught me English, convinced her husband to give my husband's brother job at ranch. When I had enough saved, she helped me buy this place. She sounds remarkable." She was, but also just person who saw need and filled it. Daniel learned that from her, or maybe she learned from him. Hard to say with couples like that, they become like one person split in 2 bodies. And now he's half a person trying to be whole. Maybe. Or maybe he's whole person who forgot what that feels like. Sometimes takes another person to remind us who we are. After Mrs. Chen left, Margaret lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, she could hear other boarders preparing for bed. Footsteps, low voices, the creak of floorboards. Life going on around her while she lay suspended between her old life and what she didn't know yet. Tomorrow she would sell her wedding dress. Thursday she would face the school board. And somehow in between she had to decide who Margaret Ellis was going to be in this new place. The discarded bride, the desperate spinster, or something else entirely. She thought of Daniel Harper's gray eyes, the way they'd seen through her devastation to something beneath. He'd called it character. She wondered what he would call the woman she was about to become if she could figure out who that was. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild chorus. It should have been frightening, but Margaret found it oddly comforting. They were calling to each other across the darkness, making sure they weren't alone. Perhaps that's all any of them were doing, calling out, hoping for an answer, refusing to give in to the silence. She picked up Sarah's journal again, turning to a page near the end. The entry was dated just a week before Sarah's death, though, of course, she couldn't have known what was coming. Taught the Carson girl to read today, really read, not just memorize. The joy on her face reminded me why this matters. Daniel says I'm changing lives, but really, they're changing mine. Every child who learns something new teaches me something too. About resilience, about hope, about the way knowledge can transform a person from the inside out. I'm so blessed to have this work, this purpose, this place where I belong. Margaret closed the journal and held it against her chest. Sarah Harper had found her place, her purpose. She'd made a difference in this rough frontier town, had been loved and mourned and remembered. Was it possible that Margaret Ellis, failed bride and aging spinster, could find the same, not the same exactly. She wouldn't try to fill Sarah's shoes or replace her in anyone's heart, but perhaps she could carve out her own space, her own purpose. The coyotes had gone silent, and the boarding house settled into sleep around her. Margaret closed her eyes, and for the first time since receiving that terrible telegram this morning, had it really only been? This morning, she didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere across town, Daniel Harper lay awake in his own bed, staring at his ceiling and wondering what had possessed him to interfere in a stranger's business. He'd gone to town for supplies and somehow ended up entangled with the abandoned bride from Boston. No, that wasn't honest. He knew exactly why he'd stopped. The way she'd been sitting on that bench like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will, he'd recognized it because he'd done the same thing so many times. After Sarah died, he'd sat on their porch for hours, days, maybe just holding himself in one piece, because if he moved, if he let go for even a second, he might scatter to the winds like dust. The woman Margaret had that same quality of forced stillness. But underneath it, he'd sensed something else. Steel, spine, whatever you wanted to call it, she had it in spades. The way she'd faced down Prudence Blackwood's condescension without flinching, the way she'd held her dignity, even in that ruined wedding dress that took a kind of courage most people never had to find in themselves. He rolled over, punching his pillow into shape. What was he thinking, suggesting she stay and teach? The town would eat her alive if she showed any weakness. The children would test her, the parents would judge her, and Prudence Blackwood would be waiting for any excuse to run her out of town. But then again, maybe that's exactly what Clearwater needed, someone who'd already survived being knocked down and had gotten back up. Someone who wouldn't be cowed by Prudence's tyranny or the town's small-minded gossip. Someone who could teach the children that there was a bigger world out there full of possibilities beyond cattle and cotton. Sarah would have liked her. The thought came unbidden and brought with it the familiar ache. Sarah would have taken one look at Margaret Ellis and adopted her like a lost puppy, would have had her teaching school and organizing socials and breathing life back into this dying town before anyone knew what hit them. "You always did see the best in people, darlin'," he murmured to the darkness, even when they couldn't see it themselves. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light through his window. In that light, he could almost see Sarah's face the way she used to look when she was planning something. That little smile that meant she was about to turn someone's world upside down in the best possible way. Maybe that's what this was, Sarah's hand from beyond pushing him to help someone the way she would have. Or maybe it was just him trying to remember how to be the man she'd believed he was. Either way, Margaret Ellis was here now, and Thursday was coming fast. He'd have to make good on his promise to speak to the school board. Judge Patterson would be fair, and Reverend Morrison had a good heart under all that fire and brimstone. But convincing Mayor Blackwood to go against his wife would take some doing. Daniel smiled grimly in the darkness. He had a few cards to play. The mayor owed him for that incident with his nephew and the stolen cattle. Daniel had caught the boy red-handed, but hadn't pressed charges, just put him to work for a summer to teach him a lesson. Blackwood had been grateful enough then. Time to see if that gratitude had staying power. As for the children, Margaret would have to teach well. They were a handful, no doubt about it. But he'd seen something in her eyes when she mentioned teaching at a factory school. She knew what real hardship looked like, what desperation did to people. These frontier kids might be wild, but they weren't hopeless. Not yet. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and bringing with it the smell of rain. A storm coming maybe, though they'd been promised storms before that never materialized. This land was hard and unforgiving, taking more than it gave most years. But every now and then it surprised you with unexpected grace rain when you needed it most, a calf that survived when it shouldn't have a stranger on a train platform who reminded you that you were still alive. Daniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he fell asleep without whiskey's help. In his dreams, Sarah was laughing, pointing at something in the distance he couldn't quite see. But her face was peaceful, approving, and when he woke just before dawn, he felt something he hadn't felt since she died. Purpose. The storm that Daniel had sensed never came, leaving only the promise of rain hanging heavy in the morning air as Margaret made her way to Morrison's general store. The blue calico dress felt strange against her skin, lighter than the layers of silk and disappointment she'd worn yesterday. In her arms, carefully folded, lay the wedding dress that had cost her everything and given her nothing but humiliation. Sam Morrison looked up from his ledger as the bell above the door chimed. His eyes widened slightly when he recognized her news of yesterday's abandonment had clearly made its rounds through every household in Clearwater. "Miss Ellis," he said carefully, as if speaking to someone who might shatter at any moment. What can I do for you this morning? Mrs. Chen suggested you might be interested in purchasing this dress, Margaret said, placing the bundle on the counter with steady hands. Or rather, that your wife might be interested in the fabric. Sam unfolded the dress carefully, whistling low when he saw the quality of the silk. This is fine work, miss, real fine. But he glanced up at her uncertainly. Are you sure you want to sell it? Quite sure, Mr. Morrison. I have no use for it now, and I need practical clothing more than sentimental keepsakes. He named a price that was more than fair, probably, more than the dress was worth to him. But Margaret didn't argue. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, and Sam Morrison's kindness, even if born from pity, would help her survive the coming weeks. My wife will make something beautiful from this, Sam said as he counted out the bills. She's got a gift for taking things apart and putting them back together better than they were. Then it's going to the right place, Margaret replied, pocketing the money. Sometimes things need to be completely unmade before they can become what they're meant to be. As she turned to leave, Sam called out, Miss Ellis, for what it's worth, the Whitmore boy is a fool. Any man who'd give you up without even meeting you face to face isn't worth the salt in his tears. Margaret paused at the door. He's not crying, Mr. Morrison. Men like Charles Whitmore never cry over women like me. We're just miscalculations to them. Numbers that didn't add up right. She left before he could respond, stepping out into the humid morning air. The town was waking up around her, shopkeepers opening their doors, ranch hands loading supplies, children darting between buildings despite their mother's scolding. Normal life continuing as if yesterday hadn't been the end of Margaret's world. But it hadn't been the end, had it? She was still here, still breathing, still moving forward, even if she didn't know where forward led. The money from the dress would buy her 3 simple dresses and a pair of sturdy boots, more suitable for frontier life than her Boston shoes. It would buy her time to prepare for Thursday's school board meeting. At Hendrick's Dry Goods, she selected her new wardrobe with careful precision. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw attention, but respectable enough for a potential schoolteacher. Mrs. Hendrick, a mouse of a woman who barely spoke above a whisper, helped her find everything she needed without asking a single question about yesterday's events. Margaret was grateful for the discretion. It was nearly noon when she encountered Daniel Harper again, this time at the feed store, where he was loading bags of grain into his wagon. He straightened when he saw her touching the brim of his hat. Miss Ellis, you're looking different. Less bridal, you mean? She managed a wry smile. I've decided tulle and humiliation don't suit me. The blue suits you better, he said simply, then seemed to catch himself. I mean more practical for the climate. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things neither quite knew how to say. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. I spoke to Judge Patterson this morning. He's willing to give you a fair hearing at the board meeting. And Mrs. Blackwood, she'll be a harder sell, but the judge carries weight. And Reverend Morrison believes everyone deserves a second chance. It's practically his sermon every other Sunday. I'm not sure I'm looking for a second chance so much as a first one, Margaret said. Everything up until now feels like it's been practice for a life I never got to live. Daniel finished securing the grain bags, his movements efficient from years of practice. Sometimes practice is all we get until the real thing comes along. He hesitated, then added, Would you like to see the schoolhouse? Might help to know what you're potentially signing up for. Margaret glanced at the son's position. Won't that cause talk? You escorting the abandoned bride around town? Let them talk. Besides, it's hardly escorting if we just happen to be going the same direction. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a small white building with a bell tower that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, one shutter hung at an angle, and the steps creaked ominously under their weight. Inside, dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through windows that needed washing, and the air held that peculiar smell of chalk and childhood that all schoolrooms seemed to possess. It needs work, Daniel said unnecessarily. Margaret walked between the rough-hewn benches, running her fingers along the scarred wood where generations of children had carved their initials and doodled their dreams. A faded map of the United States hung on one wall, still showing territories that had become states years ago. The blackboard was cracked but serviceable, and someone had left a Bible on the teacher's desk, its pages rustling in the breeze from a gap in the window frame. "It's perfect," she said softly. Daniel looked at her in surprise. "Perfect." "The roof leaks the floors uneven, and I'm pretty sure there's a family of raccoons living in the bell tower. I've taught in a factory basement where the air was so thick with cotton fibers the children could barely breathe, where the only light came from gas lamps that made everyone sick with their fumes, where we had to shout over the machinery noise just to be heard." She picked up a piece of chalk from the desk, rolling it between her fingers. "This is clean air and natural light and silence enough to think. This is perfect." She moved to the blackboard and wrote in elegant script, "Knowledge is power." Then underneath, "But wisdom is knowing how to use it." "Sarah used to say something similar," Daniel said quietly. "She believed education was about more than just reading and arithmetic. Said it was about teaching children to think for themselves, to question, to dream bigger than their circumstances." She was right. Margaret turned to face him. "Mr. Harper, Daniel, why are you really helping me? And please don't say it's just Christian charity or what Sarah would have wanted. I need to know the real reason." Daniel removed his hat, running his hand through his hair, in a gesture that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Because when I saw you on that bench yesterday, I saw myself 2 years ago. Same look in your eyes I had when I was deciding whether it was worth getting up the next morning. And I remembered what made the difference, not the people who offered sympathy or tried to cheer me up, but the ones who just saw me. Saw that I was drowning and threw me a rope without making a big fuss about it. And you think teaching school is my rope? I think having a purpose is. Teaching, ranching, building something, tearing something down. Doesn't matter what it is, as long as it gets you up in the morning with a reason beyond just surviving another day." Margaret studied him in the dusty light of the schoolroom. There was honesty in his weathered face, a kind of broken wholeness that she recognized in herself. They were both walking wounded, functioning but not fully alive, going through the motions of living while waiting for something, anything, to make it feel real again. "The school board will want to know why I stayed," she said. "Why I didn't take the next train back east where I belong." "Do you belong there?" She considered this. "I'm not sure I belong anywhere. I've been between places my whole life, too educated to be satisfied with factory work, not wealthy enough for society, too old to be a proper bride, too young to be a resigned spinster. Always just between." "Maybe that's what these children need," Daniel suggested. "Someone who understands being caught between worlds. Half of them are children of ranchers who can barely read themselves. The other half are from families with ambitions bigger than Clearwater can hold. They're all between something childhood and adulthood, ignorance and education, staying and leaving." Before Margaret could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open and 3 children tumbled in, stopping short when they saw adults present. 2 boys, clearly twins with matching shock of red hair, and a girl about 12 with serious brown eyes and a dress that had been mended too many times. "Sorry, Mr. Harper," the girl said quickly. "We didn't know anyone was here." "It's all right, Mary. This is Miss Ellis. She might be your new teacher." The twins exchanged glances that clearly communicated trouble, while Mary's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? You're going to teach us?" "Perhaps if the school board approves," Margaret said. "What are your names?" "I'm Mary Carson," the girl said. "These are the Hendricks twins, Pete and Paul. They're terrors, but they're not mean, just energetic." "We're right here," Pete or Paul protested. "And we ain't terrors," the other added. "Just creative." "Aren't," Margaret corrected automatically. "You aren't terrors." The boys looked at her with new respect. "You corrected our grammar without hitting us with a ruler," Paul or Pete said wonderingly. "Why would I hit you?" "Mistakes are how we learn, though I suspect you boys know perfectly well how to speak properly and choose not to." The twins grinned and Mary laughed. "Ma says they talk worse the more educated the person they're trying to annoy." "Then we'll have to find more creative ways to be challenging, won't we?" Margaret said mildly. "I do hope you can do better than simple grammatical rebellion. I once had a student who learned Latin just so he could insult people without them knowing. Now that was creative defiance." The children stared at her, clearly recalibrating their assessment. Daniel watched with something that might have been amusement or admiration. "Would you really teach us Latin?" Mary asked eagerly. If you master English first, Latin is like learning to run before you can walk. Possible, but you're likely to trip over your own feet. Pa says learning's waste of time for girls, Mary said, her voice dropping. Says I should focus on cooking and sewing. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And what do you say? I say I want to read every book in the world and write some of my own and maybe be a doctor like the lady I read about in Chicago. Then that's what we'll work toward, though I'd suggest starting with every book in Texas first. The world's library might take more than one lifetime. Mary beamed, and even the twins looked interested despite themselves. They peppered Margaret with questions. What subjects would she teach? Would there be homework? Did she believe in corporal punishment? Had she really come from Boston? Daniel watched Margaret handle their curiosity with patience and humor, seeing her transform from the broken woman on the bench into someone with purpose and animation. This was what she was meant to do, he realized. Teaching wasn't just her rope, it was her calling. The sun had shifted to late afternoon when the children finally left, promising or threatening in the twins' case to see her at the school board meeting. Alone again in the schoolhouse, Margaret sank onto one of the benches, suddenly exhausted. They're going to test you, Daniel warned. Those 3 are some of the brightest, but there are 27 children in the district ages 5 to 16, some eager to learn, others forced to attend, most somewhere in between. 27? Margaret repeated. That's manageable. I once had 42 in a single class in Boston. These aren't Boston children. Some of them work their family's land before dawn and after dusk. They come to school tired, hungry, sometimes angry at having to be there when there's work to be done. Their parents see education as either salvation or waste, nothing in between. Then I'll have to prove its worth to everyone, parents and children alike. She stood brushing dust from her skirt. I should go. Mrs. Chen is helping me prepare for Thursday, and I need to review Sarah's journal more thoroughly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. You have Sarah's journal. Mrs. Chen gave it to me. I hope that's all right. It's incredibly helpful, full of insights about the children and the community. Your wife was extraordinary, Daniel finished. Yes, she was, and she'd want her work to continue. It's fine. They walked back toward town together, not quite side by side, but not quite apart either. The afternoon heat had broken slightly, and clouds were building on the horizon, another promise of rain that might or might not be kept. Can I ask you something? Margaret said as they reached the boarding house. What was she like? Not as a teacher, but as a person? Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then she laughed at everything, even things that weren't particularly funny. Said the world had enough sorrow without adding to it by being serious all the time. She sang while she cooked badly but with enthusiasm. She read to me every night, poetry novels, newspaper articles, anything with words. She believed everyone had good in them, even when evidence suggested otherwise. She was light, pure light. And when she died, all the color went out of the world. It must be unbearable losing someone like that. It was, is, but lately, he paused, seeming to wrestle with the words. Lately, I'm starting to see hints of color again. Just at the edges, like when dawn's coming, but the sun's not up yet. Their eyes met and held for a moment before both looked away, overwhelmed by the implications of what wasn't being said. I should go in, Margaret said softly. Thank you for showing me the school. Thursday's meeting is at 7, Daniel reminded her. I'll be there. You don't have to, Deps. I said I would. I keep my promises. Margaret watched him walk away, his figure growing smaller against the vast Texas sky. She thought about light and color and dawn, about promises kept and purposes found. Inside, Mrs. Chen was waiting with tea and wisdom. Sarah's journal was full of guidance, and Thursday was approaching like a storm, inevitable and potentially destructive, but also possibly cleansing. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret studied every subject she might be tested on, from basic arithmetic to American history to geography. She practiced her penmanship until her fingers cramped, reviewed grammar rules she'd learned decades ago, and memorized passages from the Bible that seemed appropriately educational and moral. Mrs. Chen proved an invaluable ally, sharing gossip about each school board member that helped Margaret understand the dynamics she'd be facing. Judge Patterson had lost his own daughter to scarlet fever and had a soft spot for education. Reverend Morrison believed in redemption, but also discipline. Mayor Blackwood cared more about his image than his convictions, and Prudence Blackwood, well, she'd already shown her hand. "She fears you," Mrs. Chen said Wednesday evening as they went over last-minute preparations. "Fears what you represent. A failed bride with delusions of grandeur. An educated woman who doesn't need a man to define her. You came here for marriage, yes, but you stayed for yourself. That terrifies women like Prudence who've built their whole identity on being wives." Margaret hadn't thought of it that way, but there was truth in the observation. She'd spent so many years defining herself by what she lacked. A husband, children, wealth, youth, that she'd never considered what she had might be threatening to others. That night she barely slept. Every doubt, every fear, every possible disaster played through her mind. What if she failed the tests? What if the board rejected her outright? What if she got the position but couldn't handle the children? What if... But when Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, Margaret felt an unexpected calm settle over her. She dressed in her best new dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes, pinned her hair in a style that was severe enough to be respectable, but soft enough to be approachable, and looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't see the abandoned bride anymore, or the desperate spinster. She saw a woman with purpose, someone who'd been knocked down but had chosen to get back up. Whether the school board saw the same thing remained to be determined, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Ellis liked what she saw in her reflection. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. She reviewed her notes one more time, practiced answers to potential questions, and tried not to think about how much hinged on this evening's outcome. By 6:30, she couldn't stand waiting any longer and set out for the town hall. Daniel was already there when she arrived, standing outside like a sentinel. He'd cleaned up for the occasion. Fresh shirt jacket, brushed boots, shined. He looked uncomfortable in his formal clothes, but determined. "You came," she said, unable to hide her relief. "Said I would." He offered his arm. "Shall we—" Margaret hesitated only a moment before taking it. Let the town talk. She was done caring about appearances and propriety. She'd played by those rules her whole life, and where had it gotten her? The town hall was a simple building that served multiple purposes. Courthouse meeting place, dance hall, when occasion called for it. Tonight it had been arranged with a long table at the front where the board would sit and a single chair facing them where Margaret would be interrogated. Already townspeople were filing in to witness the spectacle. This was better than a traveling show for entertainment value. Prudence Blackwood was already seated at the center of the board table, looking like a queen holding court. To her left sat her husband, Mayor Blackwood, a thin man who seemed to shrink in his wife's presence. To her right was Reverend Morrison, his face kind but serious. Judge Patterson anchored one end of the table, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. The fifth member was someone Margaret didn't recognize, a younger man with spectacles and an earnest expression. "That's Thomas Garrett," Daniel whispered. "Owns the newspaper. Fair-minded, but he goes with the majority usually." Margaret nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. The crowd was growing, filling the available seats and lining the walls. She spotted the Carson girl and the Hendricks twins, Mrs. Chen, near the back, Sam Morrison and his wife. Charles Whitmore's mother was there too, looking smug, probably hoping to witness Margaret's final humiliation. "If everyone would please be seated," Mayor Blackwood called out in his reedy voice, "we can begin." Margaret took the chair facing the board, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Daniel positioned himself where she could see him. If she turned her head slightly, a solid, reassuring presence. "Miss Ellis," Prudence began without preamble, "you've applied for the position of school teacher for Clearwater. This is a position of great responsibility and moral authority. Why should we consider you a stranger with no connections to our community for such an important role?" Margaret had expected this opening salvo. "Mrs. Blackwood, members of the board, I believe my qualifications speak for themselves. I have a teaching certificate from the state of Massachusetts, 5 years of experience teaching children aged 5 through 16, and references from my previous employers. But more than that, I have a deep commitment to education and a belief that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserves the opportunity to learn." "Pretty words," Prudence said dismissively. But you came here as a mail-order bride, did you not? What does that say about your judgment? The crowd murmured, but Margaret didn't flinch. It says I was willing to take a chance on building a life and a family. That particular chance didn't work out, but I don't believe hope is ever foolish, Mrs. Blackwood. And I'd rather be someone who tries and fails than someone who never tries at all. Judge Patterson leaned forward. Miss Ellis, would you be willing to demonstrate your qualifications? We've prepared some tests. Of course. For the next hour, Margaret was put through her paces. She solved mathematical problems on the blackboard, identified countries on the outdated map, recited passages from memory, and parsed sentences to demonstrate her grammar knowledge. She answered questions about American history, basic science, and geography. Through it all, she remained calm and confident, her Boston education serving her well. Impressive, Judge Patterson said when she'd finished. Your academic qualifications are clearly beyond question. But what about her moral qualifications? Prudence interjected. How do we know she won't be a corrupting influence on our children? A woman who travels alone across the country, who accepts money from unmarried men. Now wait just a minute. Daniel stood up, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Miss Ellis has conducted herself with nothing but dignity since arriving here. If anyone's shown questionable morals, it's Charles Whitmore and his family abandoning a woman who traveled in good faith to marry him. Mr. Harper, you're not a board member, Prudence said coldly. Please sit down. I'll sit when you stop assassinating this woman's character without cause. Reverend Morrison raised his hand. Please let's maintain civility. Miss Ellis, perhaps you could tell us your philosophy of education? How would you approach teaching our children? Margaret stood moving to the blackboard. She picked up the chalk and wrote, Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I believe children are naturally curious, she said, turning to face the room. My job isn't to force information into their heads, but to nurture that curiosity, to give them the tools they need to explore the world and their place in it. Yes, they need to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they also need to learn how to think critically, how to solve problems, how to work together despite differences. She looked directly at Mary Carson. Some of these children will stay in Clearwater all their lives, and they'll need education to be better farmers, ranchers, business owners. Others will leave for cities, for colleges, for adventures we can't imagine, and they'll need education to compete in that wider world. My job is to prepare them for both possibilities. And discipline, as Mayor Blackwood asked. How would you maintain order, with respect, consistency, and high expectations? Children rise or fall to meet what we expect of them. I expect hard work, kindness to fellow students, and honest effort. In return, I offer fairness, patience, and the promise that I will never give up on any child, no matter how challenging they might be. She looked at the Hendricks twins who were grinning, even the creative ones who test boundaries just to see what happens. The room chuckled, tension breaking slightly. Thomas Garrett adjusted his spectacles. Miss Ellis, you're clearly qualified academically, but teaching here would be quite different from Boston. Longer hours, less resources, more challenging conditions. Why should we believe you'll stay? That you won't leave the moment a better opportunity arises? It was a fair question, and Margaret considered her answer carefully. Mr. Garrett, I came to Texas believing I was starting a new life. That life isn't what I expected, but I'm still here. I could have taken the next train back to Boston, but I didn't. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I believe there's something here worth staying for. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people she'd encountered over the past few days. I've been here less than a week, and already this community has shown me more genuine kindness than I experienced in years in Boston. Mrs. Chen took me in without question. Mr. Harper offered help to a complete stranger. Mr. Morrison gave me a fair price when he could have taken advantage. Even you sitting in judgment of me tonight are here because you care about your children's education. That's a community worth being part of, worth contributing to. Silence fell over the room. Even Prudence seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, Judge Patterson spoke. I move that we vote. All in favor of hiring Miss Ellis as Clearwater's school teacher. His hand went up immediately. Reverend Morrison's followed. Thomas Garrett hesitated, then raised his hand as well. 3 votes. She needed 1 more. Mayor Blackwood glanced at his wife, who was practically vibrating with fury. Then he looked at the crowd, saw the hopeful faces of the children, the approving nods of several parents. "The children need a teacher," he said quietly and raised his hand. The room erupted. Children cheered, adults applauded, and Prudence Blackwood stormed out in a huff that would be talked about for weeks. Margaret stood frozen, unable to quite believe what had happened. "Congratulations, Miss Ellis," Judge Patterson said, extending his hand. "School resumes Monday morning, 8 o'clock sharp. The position pays $30 a month plus housing. There's a small room attached to the schoolhouse that serves as the teacher's quarters. It's not much, but it's clean and private." "Thank you," Margaret managed, shaking his hand. "Thank you so much." The crowd surrounded her, then parents introducing themselves, children asking excited questions, everyone wanting to welcome the new teacher. Through it all, she was aware of Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd, watching with something that might have been pride. When she finally broke free, he was waiting outside. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." "Sure you could have. You're stronger than you know Margaret Ellis." It was the first time he'd said her first name without the formal Miss, and something shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. "Would you walk me back to Mrs. Chen's?" she asked. "I know it's not proper unchaperoned after dark, but propriety's overrated," and he said, offering his arm again. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere a mockingbird was singing its complicated song. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked. "Teach, learn, try to make a difference, try to build something from the ashes of what I thought my life would be." "Ashes can be good fertilizer," he said. "Some of the best things grow from ground that's been burned clear." They'd reached the boarding house, but neither moved to say goodnight. "Daniel," Margaret said softly, "why do I feel like this is the beginning of something neither of us expected?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because it is, doesn't mean we have to rush toward it or run from it. Just let it be what it's going to be." "That's not very romantic," she teased gently. "Romance is what got you on that train from Boston. Maybe something steadier is what you need now. Maybe it's what we both need." He touched his hat brim, that familiar gesture that was becoming endearing. "Good night, Margaret. I'll come by Saturday to help you get the schoolhouse ready." "I'd like that." She watched him disappear into the darkness, then went inside where Mrs. Chen was waiting with celebratory tea and probably 1,000 questions. But Margaret's mind was already racing ahead to Monday, to the children she'd teach the lessons, she'd planned the life she'd build here in this unlikely place. She'd come to Clearwater as a bride and been left at the station. But perhaps that humiliation had been a gift in disguise, forcing her to discover who Margaret Ellis really was when she wasn't trying to be someone's wife. The answer, it seemed, was a teacher. And maybe if she was brave enough to allow it, something more. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that made the Texas landscape look carved from gold and amber. Margaret stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, surveying the work ahead. Daniel had arrived before dawn with his wagon full of supplies, lumber for repairs, whitewash for the walls, new rope for the bell that hadn't rung in months. He was already on the roof, checking for loose shingles, his movement sure, despite the steep angle. "Found your raccoon family," he called down. 3 babies and a mama who's none too happy about the eviction notice." "Can we relocate them humanely?" Margaret asked, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Already planning on it. There's a hollow tree near the creek that'll suit them better. Wildlife belongs in the wild, not in bell towers." She watched him work for a moment, appreciating the economical grace of his movements. There was something deeply satisfying about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who moved with purpose and skill. She'd seen too many men in Boston who couldn't hammer a nail straight if their lives depended on it, soft-handed men who considered physical labor beneath them. "I'm going to start cleaning inside," she said. "Mrs. Chen packed lunch for us both." "That woman's a saint," Daniel replied, pulling out another loose shingle. "Tell her I'll fix her kitchen window next week, as thanks." The inside of the schoolhouse was worse than Margaret had initially thought. Years of neglect had left layers of dust spiderwebs in every corner, and what appeared to be a decade's worth of carved initials in every wooden surface. She tied a kerchief over her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. As she scrubbed, she found herself humming something she hadn't done in years. It was an old song her mother used to sing while doing housework, something about rivers and valleys and finding your way home. The acoustics of the empty schoolhouse gave her voice a richness it didn't usually possess, and she let herself enjoy the simple pleasure of working towards something meaningful. "You have a nice voice," Daniel said from the doorway, making her jump. "How long have you been standing there?" "Just a minute. Didn't want to interrupt." He held up a bucket. "Brought water from the well. Thought you might need fresh." Their fingers brushed as she took the bucket, and that same electric awareness sparked between them. It was becoming harder to ignore this pull that seemed to draw them into each other's orbit. "Daniel?" she started, then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too. But it's too soon, too complicated, too everything." Something like that. He leaned against the door frame, his expression thoughtful. "Sarah used to say I overthought things, said sometimes you just had to jump and trust the landing would sort itself out. And what do you say?" "I say that jumping's what got you on that train from Boston, and look how that turned out." Margaret laughed, surprising herself. "Point taken, though one could argue it led me here, so perhaps not a complete disaster." "Guess that depends on your perspective." He pushed off from the doorframe. "I'll get back to the roof. Those shingles won't fix themselves." The morning wore on with companionable work. Other townspeople began stopping by, some to gawk, others to genuinely help. Mary Carson and her mother brought curtains for the windows, handmade and cheerful with yellow flowers. The Hendricks twins showed up with their father, who wordlessly began fixing the broken shutters, while the boys swept the front steps with unusual diligence. "Why are you helping?" Margaret asked Pete. She'd learned to tell them apart. Pete had a scar through his left eyebrow from a fishing accident. "Pa says a good teacher's worth her weight in gold," Pete replied. "And Paul and I figure if we help now, maybe you'll go easier on us when we act up." Strategic kindness. "I appreciate the honesty. Though you should know I have an excellent memory for both good deeds and mischief." Paul grinned. "We're counting on the good deeds outweighing the mischief." Optimistic. I like that in a student. By noon, the schoolhouse was transformed. The floors were clean, the windows sparkled, fresh whitewash brightened the walls, and the repaired roof no longer leaked. Daniel had even managed to get the bell working again, its clear tone ringing across the prairie like a celebration. They sat on the front steps eating Mrs. Chen's lunch, cold chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie that tasted like autumn despite the summer heat. The work had created a strange intimacy between them, the shared purpose breaking down barriers that might have stood for months otherwise. "Tell me about your ranch," Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not much to tell. 100 head of cattle, some horses, enough land to make a living, but not enough to make a fortune. It's hard work, lonely work, since—" He stopped, took a drink of water. "Since Sarah died, I've let things slide some. Haven't had the heart for improvements or expansion." "But you're thinking about it now." He looked at her, surprised by her perception. "Maybe. Starting to remember why I loved it in the first place. The challenge of it, the way you can build something from nothing if you're willing to work hard enough. Sounds like teaching." "Suppose it is in a way. Both about nurturing something, helping it grow into what it's meant to be." Before Margaret could respond, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, moving fast. As it got closer, she could make out a rider pushing his horse hard, too hard for the heat of the day. Something was wrong. The rider was young Sam Morrison, the general store owner's son. He pulled up in front of the schoolhouse, his horse lathered with sweat. "Mr. Harper." "Thank God you're here. There's been an accident at the Whitmore place. Charles fell from his horse, hit his head bad. Doc's with him, but—" He trailed off, glancing at Margaret uncomfortably. "But what?" Daniel demanded. "Doc says he might not make it through the night. He's asking for Miss Ellis." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "For me, why—" "Don't know, ma'am. He's not making much sense, but he keeps saying your name. His mother didn't want to send for you, but Doc insisted." Daniel was already moving toward his wagon. "We'll follow you, Sam." "Daniel, I don't think—" Margaret started. "He's asking for you. Whatever his reasons, a dying man's request ought to be honored." The ride to the Whitmore ranch seemed both endless and too quick. Margaret's mind raced with questions. Why would Charles want to see her? They'd never met, had only exchanged letters. Letters full of lies, apparently. But still, what could he possibly have to say to her now? The Whitmore ranch was everything Margaret had imagined from Charles's letters. Prosperous, well-maintained with a large, two-story house that spoke of comfort and established wealth. It was everything she'd thought she was coming to the life she'd thought she was going to have. Mrs. Whitmore met them at the door, her face pinched with disapproval, despite her son's condition. "I don't know what he thinks he's doing asking for you," she said coldly to Margaret. "But Dr. Mills insists we honor his wishes." Dr. Mills, an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands, met them in the hallway. "He's delirious with fever," he explained quietly, "but he keeps calling for Miss Ellis, sometimes coherently, sometimes not. Head injuries are unpredictable." Margaret entered the sick room with trepidation. Charles Whitmore lay propped up in bed, his head heavily bandaged, his face pale and drawn. He was younger than she'd expected, almost boyish with weak features that would have been petulant in health, but now just looked pitiful. His eyes opened when she approached, focusing with difficulty. "Margaret, is that really you?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here. I'm sorry." He whispered, tears leaking from his eyes. "So sorry. Mother said, she said you were old desperate, that I could do better. But your letters, your beautiful letters." Margaret sat carefully on the edge of the bed, aware of his mother's glare boring into her back. "It's all right, Mr. Whitmore. It's done now." "No, you don't understand." He grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "I loved your letters, every word. You made me feel smart, important, like I could be more than just my mother's son." His voice grew more agitated. "I was coming to the station. I was. But she stopped me, locked me in my room like a child, said she'd disinherit me if I married you." Mrs. Whitmore made a sound of protest, but Dr. Mills silenced her with a gesture. "By the time I got free, you were gone. And then I heard Harper had taken you in, that you were staying. I wanted to come explain, but Mother said..." "Shh," Margaret soothed genuinely, moved by his distress despite everything. "You need to rest, save your strength. Will you forgive me?" His eyes were desperate, pleading. "Please, I need to know you forgive me." Margaret looked at this weak, broken boy, for that's what he was. Really a boy who'd never been allowed to become a man. She thought of her rage, her humiliation, her despair on that platform. Then she thought of where it had led her to teaching to purpose to Daniel. "I forgive you, Charles," she said softly. "Be at peace." He smiled, then his whole face transforming. "You really are as kind as your letters said." His eyes drifted closed. "Tell Harper. Tell him he's a lucky man." The room fell silent except for Charles's labored breathing. Margaret stood gently extracting her hand from his weakening grip. She turned to find Mrs. Whitmore staring at her with something that might have been shame or might have been resentment. It was hard to tell. "He's not a bad boy," the older woman said defensively, "just easily influenced." "By his mother, you mean?" Margaret's voice was steady, without accusation, but also without absolution. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed. "I was protecting him. You would have overwhelmed him. Perhaps, or perhaps I would have helped him become the man he wanted to be instead of the boy you needed him to remain." Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. "He's going to recover, Mrs. Whitmore. Dr. Mills is excellent, and Charles is young and strong. When he does, you might consider letting him make his own choices, even the wrong ones. That's how we learn." She left the room, finding Daniel waiting in the hallway. His face was unreadable, but he fell into step beside her as they left the house. They were halfway back to town before he spoke. "That was kind what you did. He didn't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, it's about releasing the poison before it kills you." She watched the landscape past the endless grass rippling like water. "Besides, he gave me something without meaning to." "What's that?" "Freedom. If he'd shown up at that station, I'd be Mrs. Charles Whitmore, now trapped in that house with that woman married to a man-child who couldn't stand up to his mother. Instead, I'm Margaret Ellis, schoolteacher, independent woman maker of my own choices. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of a small rise. Below them, Clearwater spread out like a collection of toy buildings, the late afternoon sun turning everything golden. Do you really see it that way? As freedom? She turned to look at him fully. Daniel Harper. I've been trying to be what others wanted my whole life, the dutiful daughter, the patient fiancée, the desperate bride. And where did it get me abandoned and alone at 42? She laughed, but it wasn't bitter. But that abandonment freed me to discover what I want, who I am, when I'm not trying to be someone else's idea of a woman. And who are you? I'm still figuring that out. But I know I'm someone who loves teaching, who believes in second chances, who's stronger than she knew. She paused, gathering courage. And I'm someone who's developing feelings for a widowed rancher who saved her with kindness when he could have walked away. The words hung between them like a challenge and a gift. Daniel's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles white with the effort of restraint. Margaret, Sarah's only been gone 2 years. I know. I might never be able to give you what you deserve. I'm broken in ways that might not ever heal. I'm not asking you to heal. I'm not asking for anything except honesty. He turned to her then, and she saw the war in his eyes, duty to the past against hope for the future, loyalty to the dead against the needs of the living. I dream about her less, he admitted, the word seeming to physically pain him. Used to be every night now, maybe once a week. And when I wake up and remember she's gone, it still hurts, but it doesn't make me want to die anymore. Is that betrayal? Am I betraying her by wanting to live again? Margaret reached out, covering his hand with hers. Would Sarah want you to die with her? No. The word was immediate, certain. She'd be furious with me for even considering it. She'd say, he smiled slightly, she'd say life's for living, not for mourning what's past. Then honor her by living. That's not betrayal, that's love. They sat in silence as the sun began its descent, their hands touching, neither willing to break the connection. Finally, Daniel clicked to the horses, and they continued toward town. But something fundamental had shifted. They'd acknowledged the elephant that had been growing between them since that first day on the platform. Back at the boarding house, Mrs. Chen took one look at Margaret's face and immediately started making tea. Big day. Charles Whitmore might be dying. He asked for my forgiveness. And you gave it? Yes. Good. Holding on to anger is like holding hot coal, only burns the one holding it. She studied Margaret shrewdly. But that's not what's really on your mind. Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. I told Daniel how I feel about him. Ah. Mrs. Chen poured the tea with practiced precision. And he's still mourning Sarah, as he should be. 2 years isn't very long to grieve a love like theirs. No, but grief isn't something you finish. It's something you learn to carry. Question is, can you carry it together, or does he need to carry it alone? I don't know. Mrs. Chen sat across from her, her dark eyes thoughtful. When my husband died, I thought I'd never want another man. The idea seemed like betrayal, like saying he wasn't enough. But then I realized love isn't finite resource. Having loved him didn't mean I had no love left to give. Just meant I knew how precious it was, how careful to be with it. Did you remarry too? No, but not because I was against it. Right person never came along. But Daniel Harper. He's right person for somebody. Maybe for you, if you're patient enough. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, watching the stars, thinking about Charles Whitmore, lying in his sickbed, about Daniel rebuilding his life one board at a time, about herself standing in front of 27 children come Monday morning. Life had taken such strange turns lately, leading her places she'd never expected to go. Sunday passed in a blur of final preparations. Word had come that Charles would survive, though recovery would be long and difficult. Margaret felt relief she hadn't expected, not for herself but for him. Everyone deserved a second chance, even weak-willed boys who let their mothers run their lives. She spent the day at the schoolhouse organizing supplies, writing out lesson plans, trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in her stomach. Daniel didn't come by, and she tried not to be disappointed. He needed time to process what she'd said, what was growing between them. She could give him that. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear, one of those rare August days when the heat took a breath and allowed a hint of autumn to creep in. Margaret dressed carefully in her blue calico, professional but approachable, and walked to the schoolhouse with her head high. The bell had been ringing for 5 minutes when the first children began arriving. Mary Carson was first, practically running in her eagerness. The Hendricks twins slouched in trying to look disinterested but unable to hide their curiosity. Then came others, the Murphy children, all 4 of them stair-stepped in age. Little Emma Patterson, only 5, and clinging to her older brother's hand. The Gonzalez twins, whose parents had come up from Mexico to work the ranches. Tommy Morrison, Sam's youngest, who had the reputation of being the worst troublemaker in 3 counties. By 8 o'clock, Margaret had 23 students aged 5 to 16. 4 were absent for harvest work, but their parents had promised they'd come when they could. The children sat on the repaired benches, some eager, some skeptical, all watching her with varying degrees of interest. "Good morning," Margaret said, standing at the front of the room. "I'm Miss Ellis, and I'm delighted to be your teacher. Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules." Tommy Morrison snorted. "Here comes the lecture about behavior and consequences." "Actually, Mr. Morrison, I was going to talk about respect and potential, but if you'd prefer to teach the class, please come up here." The boy's face reddened. "I didn't mean—" "Words have consequences, Mr. Morrison. You spoke without thinking, attempting to undermine my authority before I'd even begun. So now you have a choice. You can apologize and we can start fresh, or you can come up here and teach the class yourself. What'll it be?" The room held its breath. Tommy Morrison was known for never backing down, for pushing every teacher until they broke. But Margaret's calm certainty seemed to confuse him. "I apologize, Miss Ellis," he mumbled. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Clean slate, fresh start. That goes for everyone. I don't care what you've done with previous teachers, what your reputation is, or what anyone says you're capable of. In this classroom, you're all scholars with potential limited only by your willingness to work." She moved to the blackboard and wrote, "Knowledge is power, but wisdom is knowing how to use it." "Can anyone tell me what this means?" Mary Carson's hand shot up. "It means learning facts isn't enough. We need to know how to apply them." "Excellent, Mary. Can anyone give me an example?" Pete Hendricks raised his hand tentatively. "Like knowing how to read, but using it to read important things, not just dime novels." "Though dime novels have their place too," Margaret said with a smile. "Stories teach us about human nature, about possibilities beyond our immediate experience. But yes, that's the idea. Anyone else?" The ice-broken hands began going up. Even some of the older boys who'd been slouching in the back straightened up, engaged despite themselves. Margaret led them through a discussion that touched on everything from practical applications of arithmetic to the importance of understanding history to avoid repeating mistakes. "Now," she said, "I need to assess where everyone is academically. This isn't a test you can fail. It's just to help me understand what you know so I can teach you what you don't. We'll start with the youngest and work up." The morning flew by. Margaret discovered she had students at wildly different levels. Some could barely write their names, while others were ready for advanced algebra. Some read fluently, while others struggled with basic words. But what struck her most was the hunger in them, even the ones who tried to hide it. They wanted to learn to be more than their parents were, to have choices their parents never had. At lunch break, she sat on the steps watching them play. The divisions were clear: Mexican children with Mexican children, poor with poor ranchers' kids with ranchers' kids. But Mary Carson crossed those lines talking to everyone, and Margaret made a mental note to use that to encourage that breaking down of barriers. "How's the first day going?" She looked up to find Daniel standing there, hat in hand. He looked tired, like he'd slept as poorly as she had. "Better than expected. I haven't had anything thrown at me yet, which I'm told is a good sign." He smiled slightly. Tommy Morrison behaving himself. "After a brief territorial display, yes. He's actually quite bright when he forgets to be difficult. Most difficult people are." He shifted his weight clearly, wrestling with something. "Margaret, about what you said Saturday." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He sat beside her on the steps, careful to maintain proper distance with the children watching. I've been thinking about it all weekend. About Sarah, about you, about what it means to move forward without forgetting what's behind. Margaret waited, her heart hammering, but her expression calm. I can't promise you anything, he said finally. I can't promise I'll ever be whole again, or that I won't sometimes call you by her name by mistake, or that I won't have days when the grief is so heavy I can barely function. But I'd like to try. Slowly, carefully, with no expectations except honesty. Would that be enough? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Daniel Harper, that would be more than enough. He reached out briefly, squeezing her hand before releasing it. Sunday dinner after church proper and public, so the gossips have less to work with. I'd like that. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Best get back. These cattle don't tend themselves. He paused. You're good with them, the children. Natural teacher. Sarah would have been impressed. After he left, Margaret sat in a daze until the children started returning from lunch. Mary Carson approached hesitantly. Miss Ellis, are you and Mr. Harper courting? We're exploring the possibility of friendship, Margaret said carefully. Mary grinned. That's how my parents started too. Exploring friendship. They've been married 15 years now. The afternoon was devoted to reading groups with older students helping younger ones while Margaret worked with those who struggled most. She was pleased to discover several students who were natural teachers themselves, patient with their peers and creative in their explanations. As the day ended and children scattered home, Margaret felt a satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. This was right. This was what she was meant to do. Not be Charles Whitmore's wife, not return to Boston in defeat, but stand in this frontier schoolhouse and shape young minds. Tommy Morrison lingered after the others left. Miss Ellis, I'm sorry about this morning. The last teacher used to hit us with a ruler when we talked out of turn. I guess I was testing to see if you would too. And what's your conclusion? That you're different, tougher but kinder, if that makes sense. Perfect sense. Same time tomorrow, Mr. Morrison. And bring that brain of yours, we're going to put it to proper use. After he left, Margaret stood in her empty classroom looking at the work on the blackboard, the papers on her desk, the late afternoon sun streaming through windows that had been broken and dirty just days ago. She thought about Charles in his sickbed, about Daniel struggling with grief and hope, about herself standing on that platform in a wedding dress that now belonged to someone else's dreams. Life had a strange way of working out. The humiliation that should have destroyed her had instead revealed her strength. The abandonment that should have sent her running had instead given her a place to stand, and the widower who'd saved her with kindness was now offering something that might become love given time and patience. She picked up Sarah's journal, running her fingers over the worn leather. I hope I'm doing right by your town, your children, your husband, she whispered to the empty room. I'm not trying to replace you, just trying to continue what you started in my own way. A breeze rustled through the windows, setting papers fluttering like wings. Margaret chose to take it as approval, as blessing as Sarah Harper's spirit, saying, yes, this is what should happen next. The week progressed with surprising smoothness. By Wednesday, Margaret had established routines that seemed to work mathematics first thing when minds were fresh, then reading and writing history and geography after lunch, when attention flagged and stories could revive interest. She discovered that Pete Hendricks had a gift for mathematics that nobody had noticed before, that Emma Patterson could draw with startling accuracy despite never having had a lesson, that the Gonzalez twins knew 3 languages and could help her teach Spanish to interested students. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. Prudence Blackwood arrived just as school was ending, her face set in disapproving lines. Miss Ellis, I need to speak with you about your teaching methods. Margaret sent the children home and faced the woman calmly. What concerns you, Mrs. Blackwood? I've heard you're allowing Mexican children to sit with American children, that you're encouraging mixing between the social classes. I'm encouraging children to learn from each other, yes. That's not how things are done here. Perhaps it's time they were done differently. Prudence's face flushed. You've been here less than 2 weeks. You don't understand our ways, our traditions. I understand that in my classroom, all children are equal. They all have potential, they all deserve respect, and they all benefit from learning about different perspectives. If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why. How dare you, but Mrs. Blackwood, your son Billy is in my class. He's bright but lazy, coasting on his family name rather than actual effort. He could be brilliant if he applied himself, but why should he when he knows his position in society is assured regardless? Meanwhile, Juan Gonzalez, whose parents pick cotton, is teaching himself advanced algebra from a book he found discarded. Who's really being served by keeping them separated? Prudence stood speechless for a moment. Then, you're going to disrupt everything. I certainly hope so. Disruption is how progress happens. After Prudence stormed out, Margaret sat at her desk, shaking slightly. She'd just made an enemy of the most powerful woman in town, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. These children deserved better than the limitations others wanted to place on them. Friday afternoon, as she was dismissing class, she made an announcement. I'd like to start a special Saturday class for anyone interested in advanced studies, reading literature, higher mathematics, natural sciences. It's voluntary and free. Who might be interested? Every hand went up, even Tommy Morrison's. Excellent. We'll start tomorrow at 9. Bring your curiosity and any books you have at home that you'd like to share. As the children filed out, chattering excitedly, Margaret noticed Daniel waiting by the door. He'd taken to stopping by on Fridays just to check in. He said, though, she suspected he was checking on her as much as the schoolhouse. Saturday classes now, he asked. You trying to educate the whole county single-handedly? Just trying to fan the flames while they're burning. You should see these children, Daniel. They're so hungry for knowledge, for possibility. How can I not feed that hunger? You'll exhaust yourself. Perhaps, but what a glorious exhaustion it would be. He studied her, that careful way he had of looking that made her feel seen down to her bones. You're happy. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, for the first time in so long, yes. This place, these children, this purpose, it's everything I didn't know I was looking for. And Sunday dinner still interested. Very much so. Saturday's special class drew not only all her regular students, but also several older youth who'd already finished their schooling but wanted more. Margaret found herself teaching Shakespeare to ranch hands and algebra to future farmers, watching their worlds expand with each new concept. Sunday arrived with all the weight of significance Margaret had been trying not to attach to it. She dressed carefully, her green dress, which brought out her eyes, but wasn't too fancy for church. She pinned her hair, simply added her mother's small pearl earrings, and examined herself in the mirror. You look like woman going to meet her destiny, Mrs. Chen observed from the doorway. It's just dinner. Nothing with Daniel Harper is just anything. That man doesn't do things lightly. The church service was a trial of patience. Margaret sat with Mrs. Chen, aware of every eye on her, every whisper about the schoolteacher and the widower. Daniel sat 3 rows ahead, his broad shoulders and straight back achingly familiar already. How had this man become so important to her so quickly? Reverend Morrison's sermon was about rebuilding after loss, about how God sometimes demolished our plans to build something better in their place. Margaret wondered if he'd chosen the topic deliberately, then decided it didn't matter. The words resonated regardless. After the service, Daniel appeared at her elbow as if he'd materialized from thin air. Ready. As I'll ever be. He'd arranged for lunch at the hotel dining room, public enough to be proper, private enough for real conversation. They sat by a window overlooking Main Street, watching the Sunday afternoon quietness settle over the town. Tell me about Boston, Daniel said after they'd ordered. What was your life like there? So she told him about the factories, the boarding houses, the endless gray days that blurred together. About teaching children who worked 14-hour days and still showed up eager to learn. About her small rebellion, sneaking books to girls who weren't supposed to read beyond basic levels. Teaching history that wasn't in the approved curriculum, encouraging dreams that seemed impossible. You were a rebel even then, he observed with something like admiration. A quiet one. But yes, I suppose I've always chafed against arbitrary limitations. What made you answer Charles's advertisement? Margaret considered the question. Loneliness, partially. But more than that, hope. The hope that somewhere there was a life with color in it, with purpose beyond mere survival. His letters painted such a picture of wide-open spaces, of possibility, of building something together. She laughed softly. I should have known it was too good to be true. But it led you here. Yes, it led me here. She met his eyes. Do you believe in fate, Daniel? I believe in choices. Sarah chose to marry me despite her parents' objections. I chose to bring her to Texas despite the hardships. She chose to help Mrs. Chen, which led to... He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had followed. We make choices, and they lead places we never expected. And what choice are you making now with me? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the street where a dust devil swirled briefly before dissipating. I'm choosing to stop dying with her, to honor what we had by living fully again. I'm choosing to see where this path leads, even though it terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because I could love you. The words came out rough, honest. I can feel it starting already different from what I felt for Sarah, but just as real. And losing that kind of love once nearly killed me. I don't know if I could survive it twice. Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, propriety be damned. Then we'll just have to be very careful with each other, won't we? The tenderness of that moment in the hotel dining room lingered between them like a promise, as autumn crept across the Texas plains. The weeks that followed their first official dinner became a careful dance of growing closer while respecting the ghost that still walked between them. Daniel would stop by the schoolhouse on Tuesday afternoons to repair something that didn't really need fixing, and Margaret would happen to have made too much soup or bread, insisting he stay to help her finish it. The town watched with the fascination of people who had little entertainment beyond their neighbors' lives. Some approved Sam Morrison told anyone who'd listen that it was about time Daniel Harper remembered he was alive. Others, particularly Prudence Blackwood's circle, whispered about the impropriety of it all, a widow barely 2 years bereaved courting an abandoned bride who'd been in town less than a month. But Margaret had stopped caring what the gossips said. Her days were full of purpose, her evenings full of planning, and increasingly her thoughts were full of Daniel Harper. Not in the desperate, grasping way she'd thought of Charles Whitmore during their correspondence that had been about escaping her life. This was about building something new from the scorched earth both she and Daniel had been left standing on. October arrived with unexpected rain that turned the dust to mud and brought out wildflowers that had been waiting all summer for their chance to bloom. Margaret stood at the schoolhouse window watching her students arrive for the day, their boots squelching through puddles, their faces bright with the excitement that came from breaking routine. "Miss Ellis!" Mary Carson burst through the door, water streaming from her coat. "The creek's rising, Pa says. If it keeps raining, we might not be able to cross for days." Margaret had learned enough about frontier life to know this was serious. Several of her students lived on the far side of Clearwater Creek, which was usually little more than a trickle, but could become a raging torrent with enough rain. "Everyone from across the creek gather your things," she announced. "I'm dismissing you early so you can get home safely. Everyone else will continue with lessons, but be prepared to leave if your parents come for you." As the creekside children hurried out, Margaret noticed Tommy Morrison lingering. His family's ranch was on the far side of the creek, but he made no move to leave. "Mr. Morrison, shouldn't you be heading home?" The boy, usually so cocky and self-assured, looked uncomfortable. "Pa's away on a cattle drive. Ma's alone with the little ones. If I go back now, I'll be stuck there maybe for days," and he trailed off. "And you don't want to miss school," Margaret finished, understanding dawning. "You've been enjoying the advanced mathematics we've been working on." His face reddened. "Don't tell anyone. Got a reputation to maintain. Your secret's safe with me. But where will you stay if the creek rises?" "Was hoping maybe Mr. Harper might have room. I can work for my keep, and his place is this side of the creek." As if summoned by his name, Daniel appeared in the doorway, water dripping from his hat. "Margaret, the creek's rising fast. I've come to—" He stopped, noticing her reduced class. "Good. You've already sent the creekside kids home." "Tommy needs a place to stay if the water keeps rising," Margaret said. "His father's away." Daniel studied the boy with that measured look Margaret had come to recognize as him making a decision. "You any good with cattle, son?" "Yes, sir. Been working them since I could sit a horse." "Then you can bunk in my spare room and earn your keep. But you continue your schoolwork in the evenings. Understood? Miss Ellis will send work with you." Tommy's relief was palpable. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As the boy gathered his things, Daniel moved closer to Margaret, his voice low. This storm's going to get worse before it gets better. You should close school for the rest of the day. Let everyone get home safe. She nodded, trusting his reading of the weather. Children, we're dismissing early. Those of you with younger siblings, make sure they get home safely. We'll resume when the weather clears. As the classroom emptied, Daniel lingered. The teachers' quarters here aren't the safest in a bad storm. That roof's still weak in spots despite our repairs. You should stay in town at Mrs. Chen's. I'll be fine, Daniel. I've weathered storms before. Not Texas storms. Not alone. Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was fear there, old fear that had nothing to do with weather. Sarah, she asked gently. The cholera came during a storm, he said roughly. I always wondered if we'd noticed sooner if the weather had been clear, if we could have gotten to town faster. He shook his head. I know it's not rational. Disease doesn't care about weather, but storms still make me... He trailed off. Margaret touched his arm lightly. I'll stay at Mrs. Chen's. I promise. Relief flickered across his face. Good. I'll check on you tomorrow after I see how my cattle fared. Be careful, she said, meaning more than just with the storm. You too, he replied. And she knew he understood. The storm that hit that night was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and tearing at roofs. Lightning split the sky with purple-white brilliance, and thunder shook the very foundations of Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Margaret sat in the kitchen with the older woman drinking tea and trying not to jump at every crash. First Texas storm, Mrs. Chen asked with a knowing smile. First like this, yes. In Boston, storms were just wind and rain. This is biblical. This land doesn't do anything by halves. When it's dry, it's bone dry. When it rains, it floods. When it loves completely. When it hates, she shrugged. You learn to respect it, work with it, instead of against it. Is that what you've done? Worked with it? Had to. This place killed my husband, could have killed me. But I chose to see what it offered instead of what it took. Safety was never the goal, living was. Margaret thought about that as she lay in bed that night listening to the storm rage. She'd come to Texas seeking safety, the security of marriage, of belonging somewhere, of being someone's wife. Instead, she'd found danger and uncertainty and possibility. She'd found herself teaching in a one-room schoolhouse with a leaky roof and 27 children who challenged her daily. She'd found herself falling in love with a man still haunted by his dead wife. And somehow, impossibly, she'd found herself happier than she'd ever been. The storm passed in the night, leaving the morning washed clean and sparkling. The sun emerged tentatively at first, then with full Texas enthusiasm, turning puddles into mirrors and making the wet grass gleam like emeralds. Margaret picked her way carefully through the muddy streets to check on the schoolhouse. The building had survived, though barely. Part of the roof had lifted and resettled askew, and one window had broken, letting rain soak a corner of the room. But the structure stood defiant and proud, like everything else in this harsh land that refused to surrender. She was sweeping water out the door when she heard horses approaching. Daniel and Tommy Morrison rode up, both looking tired but whole. Lost 3 head of cattle to the flooding, Daniel said without preamble. Could have been worse. How's the schoolhouse? Wounded but not defeated, like everything else around here apparently. Tommy dismounted and immediately began assessing the damage with the eye of someone used to fixing what broke. I can patch that roof temporarily, Mr. Harper. Enough to keep more rain out until we can fix it proper. Good man. I'll help. Margaret, you shouldn't be here alone. The creek's still too high for folks to cross, might be days before your full class can return. Then I'll work with whoever can make it. Education doesn't stop for weather. Daniel smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his weathered face. Sarah said the same thing once. Taught school with 2 students during a blizzard, said if they were brave enough to show up, she was obligated to teach. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah without pain tightening his features. Progress, Margaret thought. Small, but real. For 3 days, the creek remained impassable. Margaret taught the 8 students who could reach the schoolhouse, turning the small group into an opportunity for intensive instruction. She discovered that without the social dynamics of the full class, some students flourished. Billy Blackwood freed from the need to maintain his position as the mayor's son showed a genuine aptitude for writing. Emma Patterson, usually overshadowed by louder children, revealed a quick wit and sharp intelligence. Daniel stopped by each afternoon, always with some excuse checking the roof, bringing supplies, making sure she was safe. On the third day, he arrived with something else, a letter. "Postal Service finally got through," he said, handing her the envelope. "It's from Boston." Margaret's heart sank. The return address was her former employer at the factory school. With trembling fingers, she opened it, aware of Daniel watching with concern. "Dear Miss Ellis," she read aloud, "we have recently received an inquiry about your character and qualifications from the Clearwater School Board. While we were surprised to learn of your relocation to Texas, we are pleased to provide the highest recommendation for your teaching abilities, moral character, and dedication to education. The loss of you to our institution is clearly Clearwater's gain." She looked up from the letter to find Daniel smiling. "You had them check my references, Met." "Wasn't me." Judge Patterson takes his school board duties seriously. Wanted to make sure we hadn't hired a confidence woman or worse. His expression grew serious. "There's more. Turn it over." On the back in different handwriting was a personal note. "Margaret, we pooled our resources and are sending under separate cover a package of books for your new school. The children here still ask when you're coming back. I tell them you've gone to teach cowboys and Indians in the Wild West. They think you're the bravest woman alive. So do I. Martha." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Martha had been another teacher at the factory school, the closest thing to a friend she'd had in Boston. "Books are coming," she said wonderingly. "Real books for the children. That's what has you emotional, not the validation of your character." "I never doubted my character. But books." "Daniel, do you understand what this means? I can teach them properly now with real resources, not just whatever cast-offs we can find." He moved closer, and she realized they were alone in the schoolhouse for the first time since their dinner. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes into gold and casting long shadows across the floor. "You really love this, don't you, teaching?" "It's who I am," she said simply. "When I was pretending to be a potential bride, I was acting." The standing in front of those children, watching, understanding dawn in their eyes, seeing them grasp possibilities they never imagined, this is real. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "Do you know that most women would have run back to Boston after what happened at the station? You stayed and built something from nothing. Not from nothing, from the kindness of a stranger who became..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Became what?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Everything," she admitted. "Somewhere between that day at the station and now you became everything." The space between them evaporated. Daniel's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Margaret, I..." The schoolhouse door burst open. "Miss Ellis, Mr. Harper." It was Pete Hendricks gasping for breath. "The creek's dropping. Pa says folks can cross by morning. We can have school again." The moment shattered, but something had been acknowledged that couldn't be taken back. Daniel stepped away, but his eyes held promises that made Margaret's heart race. "That's wonderful news, Pete," she managed. "Spread the word regular classes resume tomorrow." As the boy ran off, Daniel cleared his throat. "I should check on Tommy, make sure he's ready to go home tomorrow." "Of course." He paused at the door. "Margaret, what you said about everything, I meant it. I know, that's what terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure." He touched his hat brim and was gone, leaving Margaret standing in the golden light of her classroom, feeling as though the world had shifted on its axis. The next morning brought controlled chaos as all 27 students returned full of stories about the storm and the flooding. The Gonzalez twins had helped save their neighbor's chickens from drowning. Mary Carson had delivered a calf during the worst of the thunder. Tommy Morrison, trying to reclaim his reputation after staying on the safe side of the creek, regaled everyone with tales of working Daniel Harper's ranch. "Mr. Harper's teaching me to break horses," he boasted. "Says I have natural talent." "Is that so?" Margaret asked. catching Daniel's eye as he appeared in the doorway. He'd taken to arriving just as school dismissed a habit that fooled no one but maintained the pretense of propriety. "Boy's got good instincts," Daniel confirmed. "Offered him work next summer if he keeps his grades up." Tommy's chest puffed with pride, and Margaret saw several other boys look at him with new respect. Academic success suddenly had tangible rewards. As the weeks passed and October melted into November, the relationship between Margaret and Daniel deepened with the steady inevitability of seasons changing. They were careful, always maintaining proper boundaries in public, but the whole town could see what was growing between them. Prudence Blackwood made one last attempt to interfere, cornering Margaret after church one Sunday. "You should know," she said in a voice meant to carry, "that several parents have expressed concern about your situation. An unmarried woman carrying on with a widower sets a poor example for impressionable children." Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mrs. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern for propriety. Perhaps you could explain to these concerned parents that Mr. Harper and I are conducting ourselves with absolute correctness. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that widowers should remain alone forever. That would be a rather harsh sentence, don't you think? That's not what I... Or perhaps you believe that once a woman has been disappointed in love, she should accept spinsterhood without complaint. That seems equally harsh. Unless... Margaret paused as if struck by a thought. Unless your concern is that two people who have suffered loss might find comfort in each other's company, surely Christian charity wouldn't forbid such a thing. Prudence's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Several townspeople who'd been listening snickered, and even Reverend Morrison seemed to be hiding a smile behind his hand. "I'm merely thinking of the children," Prudence managed. "As am I, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm teaching them that life can offer second chances, that dignity can be maintained through adversity, and that kindness matters more than gossip. All lessons I believe they need to learn." She swept away Daniel at her side, leaving Prudence standing in defeated silence. Once they were out of earshot, Daniel chuckled. "You've got a tongue like a razor when you want to. Only when defending something worth defending. And what we have, is it worth defending?" She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Daniel Harper, what we have is worth everything." November brought the first real cold snap, and with it a problem Margaret hadn't anticipated. Several of her students arrived at school, shivering their coats, too thin or too small to provide real warmth. The schoolhouse's old stove barely heated the room, and she watched children try to write with fingers stiff from cold. That evening, she discussed it with Mrs. Chen over dinner. "Every winter, same problem," the older woman said. "Families too proud to admit they can't afford proper coats. Children suffer for parents' pride. There must be something we can do." Mrs. Chen studied her thoughtfully. "Sarah used to organize sewing circles. Women would gather, make quilts and clothes, pretend it was for charity somewhere else. Then items would mysteriously appear where needed." "Brilliant. We could do the same, but perhaps more directly. A winter clothing drive for the school frame. It as community support for education rather than charity." Within a week, Margaret had organized what she called the Clearwater School Winter Readiness Campaign. Women who'd initially resisted her influence found themselves drawn into the project despite themselves. Even Prudence Blackwood donated fabric, though she made sure everyone knew it was for the principle of education, not because she approved of Margaret personally. The sewing circle met in the schoolhouse on Saturday afternoons. Margaret taught while the women worked, and gradually barriers began breaking down. Mrs. Gonzalez shared her technique for reinforcing seams, while Mrs. Morrison translated instructions for those who spoke little English. Mary Carson's mother revealed she'd once been a seamstress in St. Louis before marrying a rancher. Daniel found her there one Saturday, surrounded by women and fabric and the warm chatter of community building itself. "You've done something," he said wonderingly when the women had gone. "I haven't seen the town's women work together like that since Sarah died. They just needed a reason that let them keep their dignity while helping. Everyone wants to contribute. They just need permission." He pulled her into his arms, then there in the schoolhouse with the late afternoon sun painting everything golden. "You're healing more than just the children you know. You're healing the whole town." "I'm healing myself too," she admitted against his chest. Every day, every small victory, every child who learned something new, it's putting me back together in ways I didn't know I needed. I love you. The words came out sudden and raw, as if torn from him against his will. I didn't mean to try not to, but Margaret Ellis, I love you with whatever's left of my heart. She pulled back to look at his face, seeing the fear and hope warring in his eyes. Whatever's left is more than enough for me. I love you too, Daniel. Not as a replacement for what you've lost, not as a consolation prize, but as you are scarred and careful and absolutely worth loving. He kissed her. Then their first real kiss since everything had started. It was tender and desperate and full of promise, tasting of coffee and possibility and second chances. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. What? I know it's too soon, too fast, too everything, but I've learned life's too short and too unpredictable to waste time when you know something's right. Marry me, Margaret. Not because you need rescuing or I need replacing what I've lost, but because together we're building something new and good and worth protecting. Margaret's heart raced. Daniel, the town already gossips. Let them. I'm tired of living for other people's opinions. The only opinion that matters is yours. Will you marry me? Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. When you're ready. She thought of that desperate woman in the wedding dress on the platform waiting for a life that never came. She thought of the resignation she'd felt boarding that train to Texas, thinking she was settling for whatever she could get. She thought of Charles Whitmore's weak apologies and his mother's cold judgment. Then she thought of Daniel's steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he'd seen her not as a failed bride, but as a woman with value and purpose. She thought of the life they were already building, Sunday dinners, and afternoon visits, and shared looks across crowded rooms. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her answer. Yes, I'll marry you, but not until the school year ends. These children need stability, and I won't abandon them mid-term. June, then. June. He kissed her again, sealing the promise. We should tell people properly, make an announcement. At Thanksgiving, Margaret suggested. The whole town will be gathered for the harvest celebration. We can tell everyone at once, deal with the reactions, and move forward. Strategic. I like it. Though I should probably speak to Judge Patterson first and Reverend Morrison. Do this properly. Since when do we do anything properly? You rescued an abandoned bride. I fell in love with a grieving widower, and we're building a life on the ashes of our former dreams. Nothing about us is proper. No, he agreed, but it's ours. The weeks leading to Thanksgiving passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Margaret threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, knowing she was building something that would last beyond her own tenure. She started training Mary Carson and Tommy Morrison as teaching assistants, preparing them to help whoever might follow her. The box of books from Boston arrived the week before Thanksgiving, causing such excitement among the students that Margaret had to institute a careful lending system to prevent chaos. Real novels, poetry collections, science texts, history books, treasures beyond imagining for children who'd been sharing the same few tattered readers. Daniel formally asked Judge Patterson and Reverend Morrison for their blessing, which both gave readily. The judge even smiled, saying, "About time, Harper. That woman's the best thing to happen to this town in years, and you're the only man with sense enough to deserve her." The Thanksgiving celebration was held in the town hall tables groaning with food, the air rich with laughter and conversation. Margaret had helped organize it, working with the other women as if she'd always been part of the community. Even Prudence Blackwood had to admit grudgingly that the new school teacher had a gift for bringing people together. As the meal wound down and people sat satisfied and content, Daniel stood tapping his knife against his glass for attention. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "Most of you know I'm not one for speeches, but sometimes a man has something to say that needs witnesses, needs community, needs to be declared in front of the people who matter." The room fell silent, everyone sensing something momentous was coming. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. Sarah's death nearly killed me too, and for a long time I wished it had. I was a dead man walking, going through the motions but not really living. He looked at Margaret, his eyes soft with emotion. Then this woman arrived on the worst day of her life, abandoned and humiliated, and somehow found the strength not just to survive, but to thrive. She took our children and gave them dreams. She took our divided community and started bringing it together. She took a broken-down widower and reminded him that life was worth living. He moved to stand beside Margaret's chair, taking her hand. Margaret Ellis has agreed to marry me come June after school term ends. We wanted you all to know to be part of this because you're not just our neighbors, you're our family. For a moment, the silence held. Then Mary Carson started clapping, followed by Tommy Morrison, then the Hendricks twins, and suddenly the whole room erupted in applause and cheers. Women dabbed at their eyes, men slapped Daniel on the back, and children danced around Margaret like she was a fairy tale princess. Only Prudence Blackwood sat silent, but even she couldn't maintain her disapproval in the face of such universal joy. Finally, she stood and raised her glass. "To second chances," she said, and if it came out a bit forced, at least she said it. Later, as Daniel walked Margaret back to Mrs. Chen's under a canopy of stars, she asked, "Any regrets we've just committed ourselves in front of the entire town?" "My only regret is that June is 7 months away. It'll pass quickly, and we have so much to do before then. The school needs expanding if we're going to accommodate all the children who want to attend. Your ranch needs attention you haven't given it since Sarah died. We need to figure out where we're going to live." "The ranch," Daniel said immediately. "If you're willing. I know it's isolated, but it's home," Margaret finished. "Or it will be. Our home." They stopped walking, standing in the middle of the empty street, the night air crisp around them. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "if someone had told me when I was sitting on that platform in my ruined wedding dress that in a few months I'd be engaged to a different man teaching school and genuinely happy, I'd have thought they were insane. Life's funny that way. The worst moments sometimes lead to the best outcomes." "Do you think Sarah would approve?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "She'd probably say it was about time I stopped moping and started living. She'd like you, Margaret. You both have that same core of steel, that same belief that people are better than they think they are. I wish I could have known her." "In a way you do. Every child you teach carries a bit of her influence. Every improvement you make to the school builds on what she started. You're not replacing her, you're continuing the work in your own way." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We're building something new from the pieces of what was broken. Both of us." "Together," he agreed. As they resumed walking, Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, frightened, willing to marry a stranger to escape her life. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more purposeful, more fully herself than she'd ever been. The schoolhouse bell rang in the distance, wind catching it probably, but Margaret chose to take it as a sign, a calling, a promise. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. The winter months that followed their Thanksgiving announcement passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. December brought snow unusual for that part of Texas, transforming the landscape into something magical and foreign. Margaret stood at the schoolhouse window watching her students have their first real snowball fight, their laughter carrying across the white blanketed ground like bells. "You're going to let them stay out there until they're frozen solid, aren't you?" Daniel's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. "Look at them," she said softly. "Some of these children have never seen snow before. How can I call them inside when they're discovering winter magic?" He moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and comforting. "You see magic in everything in teaching in this town, in those wild heathens throwing snow at each other. Don't you?" He was quiet for a moment, watching Pete Hendricks stuff snow down his brother's collar while Mary Carson constructed an elaborate snow fort. "I'm starting to. Seeing things through your eyes makes everything look different." "Miss Ellis." Emma Patterson ran up, her cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Can we build a snowman?" "A really big one right here in front of the school." "I think that's a wonderful idea, but everyone needs to work together. No exceptions." Within minutes, all 27 students were cooperating in a way Margaret had never seen before. The older boys rolled huge snowballs for the base, while the younger children gathered sticks for arms. The Gonzalez twins produced a worn serape to use as a scarf. and Tommy Morrison surprised everyone by pulling a carrot from his lunch pail for the nose. "You brought a carrot to school?" Margaret asked, amused. "Ma makes me eat vegetables," he mumbled, embarrassed. "Figure the snowman needs it more than I do." As they worked, other townspeople began gathering. Parents coming to collect their children stayed to help. Sam Morrison brought coal from his store for the buttons and eyes. Even Mrs. Chen appeared with a pot of hot cocoa, setting up an impromptu warming station on the schoolhouse steps. "This is what she did," Daniel said quietly to Margaret. "Sarah, she had this gift for creating moments that brought people together. You have it too." "Maybe it's not about the person," Margaret suggested, watching Billy Blackwood help little Emma Patterson reach high enough to place the snowman's eyes. "Maybe it's about the place being ready for connection. These people want community, they just need permission to reach for it." The snowman, when finished, stood nearly 8 feet tall, wearing Tommy's carrot nose with dignity and the Gonzalez serape with flair. Someone had found an old hat, and Mary Carson had fashioned a surprisingly realistic smile from strips of leather. The entire town, it seemed, stood admiring their collective creation as the sun set, painting the snow pink and gold. "School photo, po," Judge Patterson called out, having appeared with his camera. "Everyone gather round." Margaret found herself at the center of the group, her students pressed close, Daniel standing just behind her shoulder. As the judge adjusted his equipment, she felt a hand slip into hers. Emma Patterson. Shy little Emma, who rarely spoke above a whisper. "Miss Ellis," the child said quietly, "are you really going to leave us when you marry Mr. Harper?" The question hit Margaret like cold water. She'd been so focused on the wedding, on building a life with Daniel, that she hadn't fully considered what it would mean for her teaching. Married women didn't typically continue working, especially not when marrying a rancher who could support them. She started, then stopped, realizing she didn't have an answer. The photograph was taken capturing her moment of uncertainty, though no one else seemed to notice. As families dispersed and children headed home, Margaret remained standing by the snowman, her mind racing. "What's troubling you?" Daniel asked, reading her mood with the intuition that had developed between them. "Emma asked if I'll stop teaching when we marry." Daniel's face went carefully neutral. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing." "I didn't know what to say." She turned to face him fully. "Daniel, what are your expectations about me teaching after we're married?" He was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret felt her heart sink. Of course he'd expect her to stop. It was the way of things. Married women ran households, raised children, supported their husbands' work. They didn't continue independent careers. "I watched Sarah struggle with that choice," he said finally. "She loved teaching, but everyone said married women shouldn't work. She gave it up for me, and I think part of her light dimmed when she did. She was happy, don't misunderstand, but there was always this wistfulness when she'd see the children heading to school." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I won't make the same mistake twice. If teaching makes you who you are, then I'd be a fool to ask you to stop. We'll figure out the logistics. Maybe you teach part-time. Maybe we hire help for the ranch house. Maybe something we haven't thought of yet. But Margaret, I fell in love with the woman who stood up to the school board and transformed this town's children. Why would I want to change that?" Relief flooded through her so intensely her knees nearly buckled. "You remarkable man! Do you have any idea how unusual you are? Unusual or just practical? A happy wife makes for a happy life, my father used to say, though I doubt he meant it quite this way." Christmas came with the blizzard that kept everyone home for 3 days. When the weather finally cleared, Margaret made her way to Daniel's ranch for the first time since their engagement. She'd been there briefly before, but always with others, always formally. This time she came alone at his invitation to see what would become her home. The house was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It sat on a rise overlooking the vast expanse of Daniel's land, the barn and outbuildings arranged in a practical pattern below. Everything was well-maintained but austere, functional, but lacking warmth. "Sarah's touches are mostly gone," Daniel said apologetically as he showed her through the rooms. "I couldn't bear the reminders at first, packed everything away. Now it just looks lonely," Margaret finished gently. "It looks lonely. The parlor held good furniture covered in dust sheets. The kitchen was spacious but hadn't seen a proper meal prepared in who knew how long. Upstairs doors stood closed on rooms that hadn't been entered in months, maybe years. This was going to be the nursery, Daniel said, his hand on one doorknob but not turning it. Sarah was so excited, had it all planned out. After she died, I nailed it shut. Couldn't stand to see it empty. Would you mind if I opened it? Not now, but someday. He looked at her with something like wonder. You'd want to do that. Daniel, I can't give you back what you lost, but maybe we can fill some of these empty spaces with new dreams. Different dreams, but no less valid. He pulled her into his arms, then holding her tight against his chest. How did I get this lucky twice in one lifetime? Not luck, Margaret murmured against his shirt. Choice. You chose to stop and help a stranger. You chose to risk loving again. You chose to see possibility where others saw only endings. They spent the day planning which rooms would be used for what improvements were needed, how to make the house a home again without erasing Sarah's memory. Margaret suggested keeping Sarah's garden plot, but adding her own touches, mixing the old with the new. We could host the sewing circle here, she said, standing in the large parlor, and maybe start a lending library with those books from Boston. Make this a gathering place again. Sarah would have loved that idea. Then we'll do it for both of us, honoring the past while building the future. January brought unexpected challenges. A fever swept through the town, hitting the children particularly hard. Margaret converted the schoolhouse into a makeshift infirmary nursing sick students while trying to keep up with lessons for those still healthy. Daniel worked alongside her, bringing supplies, helping with the worst cases, never complaining about the long hours or the risk of contagion. You don't have to do this, Margaret told him one particularly difficult night as they sat vigil over Tommy Morrison, whose fever had spiked dangerously high. Yes, I do. These are your children, which makes them mine by extension. Besides, he added with grim humor, I've already survived losing everything once. Fear doesn't have the same hold on me anymore. Tommy's fever broke near dawn, and Margaret wept with relief. Daniel held her as she cried, exhausted and overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility she'd taken on. You can't save them all, Basi, he said gently. It's not possible. But I have to try. How can I not try? I know, it's who you are. Just remember to take care of yourself, too. I've already lost one woman to giving too much of herself. I won't lose another. The fever passed, leaving all the children recovered, but the town shaken. Parents who'd taken education for granted suddenly realized how much Margaret meant to their children, how she'd risked her own health to care for them. Support for the school and for her continued teaching after marriage grew stronger. February arrived with unexpected warmth, what the locals called false spring. Margaret used the mild weather to take her students on educational walks, teaching them about local flora and fauna geography and survival skills. It was during one such walk that they made a disturbing discovery. Miss Ellis, Pete Hendricks came running from the creek bed where he'd been exploring. There's something you need to see. What they found was evidence of rustling the remains of a camp running irons for changing brands and tracks leading toward Daniel's land. Margaret sent the children back to school immediately and rode to find Daniel. She found him at the north pasture, already aware of the problem. Lost 20 head last night, he said grimly. Whoever's doing this is getting bold. Should we contact the sheriff? County sheriff's 3 days ride away and useless besides. This is something we handle ourselves. He paused, studying her face. You disapprove. I disapprove of violence, but I also understand that law means something different out here. She thought of her students, of the families struggling to make ends meet. If someone's stealing cattle, they're stealing livelihoods, children's futures. That I can't abide. Daniel organized a group of local ranchers to patrol at night. Margaret, meanwhile, used her position to gather information. Children she'd learned heard everything and loved to share what they knew. Within a week, she had a pretty good idea who was involved: drifters who'd been camping near the old mine seen by the Gonzalez twins when they were hunting rabbits. The confrontation came on a moonless night. Margaret waited at the ranch house pacing while Daniel and the other men rode out. She'd wanted to go with them, but Daniel had flatly refused, and for once, she hadn't argued. Some battles weren't hers to fight. They returned at dawn tired but victorious. The rustlers had been caught red-handed and given a choice: leave the county immediately or face frontier justice. They'd chosen to leave. No one was hurt, Margaret asked, checking Daniel for injuries. A few bruises, nothing serious. Though Sam Morrison might have trouble sitting for a few days, took a tumble off his horse trying to look heroic. And the cattle? Most recovered. We'll lose some money this year, but we'll survive. The incident brought the community even closer together. The shared danger, the collective response had reminded everyone that they depended on each other. Margaret noticed it in small ways. Families who'd barely spoken now greeting each other warmly. Ranchers sharing resources more readily. A general sense of, we're all in this together. March roared in with winds that threatened to tear the schoolhouse roof off entirely. Daniel and several other men spent a weekend doing proper repairs, reinforcing the structure against future storms. Margaret kept them fed and hydrated, managing the chaos with the same calm efficiency she used in the classroom. "You're going to make a good rancher's wife," Mrs. Morrison observed, watching Margaret direct the meal service. "Got the organizational skills for it?" "I'm going to make a good wife, period," Margaret replied. "The ranching is just details." April brought wildflowers and wedding planning in earnest. Margaret had resisted any elaborate ceremony. Her first attempt at a wedding had been elaborate enough, but the town had other ideas. "You can't just sneak off to the courthouse," Mary Carson insisted with all the authority a 13-year-old could muster. "We want to see you get married. You're our teacher." "And it's not just about you," Mrs. Chen added pragmatically. "This town needs celebration, needs ritual. Your wedding is excuse for everyone to come together to mark new beginning." So Margaret found herself planning a wedding that had somehow become a town festival. The women took over organizing food decorations and music. The men constructed a dance platform behind the church. The children practiced songs to perform. Even Prudence Blackwood contributed, offering her home for the reception, though Margaret suspected it was more about maintaining her position as social leader than genuine warmth. Through it all, Margaret continued teaching her students more focused than ever as they prepared for end-of-year examinations. She was determined that her marriage wouldn't disrupt their education, and they seemed determined to prove worthy of her faith in them. May arrived in a burst of heat that reminded everyone summer was coming. The schoolhouse, even with windows open, became stifling by afternoon. Margaret moved lessons outside when possible, conducting classes under the large oak tree behind the building. It was there 2 weeks before the wedding that Charles Whitmore appeared. He'd recovered from his injury but walked with a slight limp. His face had matured somehow, the boyish weakness replaced by something approaching determination. Margaret's students fell silent as he approached everyone, knowing the story of the abandoned bride. "Miss Ellis," he said formally, removing his hat. "Might I have a word?" Margaret stood smoothing her skirts. "Children, continue reading Chapter 4. Mary, you're in charge." She walked with Charles to a distance where they wouldn't be overheard but remained in sight. Propriety still mattered, perhaps more now than ever. "You look well," Charles said awkwardly. "As do you. How can I help you, Mr. Whitmore?" "I came to thank you, and to apologize again, and to tell you something." He took a deep breath. "I'm leaving, heading to California. My uncle has a business there, offered me a position." "Your mother must be devastated." A wry smile crossed his face. "She's threatened to disown me, but for the first time in my life, I don't care. You were right what you said that day. I need to make my own choices, even the wrong ones." "I'm glad, Charles, truly." "I also wanted to say Harper's a good man. You chose better than you would have with me. I didn't choose Daniel because he was better than you. I chose him because we're right for each other. There's a difference." Charles nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand that. Maybe in California I'll find someone who's right for me, not just approved by my mother." "I hope you do." He started to leave, then turned back. "The money, the dowry my mother was supposed to pay but never did, I've arranged for it to go to the school. A wedding gift, I suppose. Or an apology. Take it however you prefer." Before Margaret could respond, he walked away, his limp barely noticeable in his determination to move forward. Margaret stood watching until he disappeared, then returned to her students. Is everything all right, Miss Ellis? Mary asked with concern. Everything's perfect, Margaret replied, and meant it. The final week of school was bittersweet. Margaret had arranged for a summer teacher, a young woman from Dallas, who'd just finished her training so the children wouldn't lose momentum. But saying goodbye even temporarily was harder than she'd expected. You'll be back in the fall, though, right? Emma Patterson asked tearfully. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, Margaret promised. Mrs. Harper will be here bright and early come September. Mrs. Harper, Tommy Morrison repeated with a grin. That's going to take some getting used to. On the last day, the children presented her with a gift, a quilt they'd secretly worked on with their mother's help. Each square contained something representing a different student, a horse, for Tommy books, for Mary, mathematical equations for Pete Hendricks. At the center was an embroidered schoolhouse with the words, Miss Ellis, our teacher, our friend, below it. Margaret cried openly, not caring who saw. These children had given her purpose when she'd thought she had none. They'd helped her discover who she really was beneath all the roles she'd tried to play. The wedding day dawned perfect clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the kind of golden light that made everything look blessed. Margaret stood in Mrs. Chen's room wearing a simple white dress that was nothing like the elaborate gown she'd worn to the train station nearly a year ago. This dress was practical, beautiful in its simplicity, and entirely her choice. You ready? Mrs. Chen asked, pinning the last flower in Margaret's hair. I've been ready since the day he asked me to read from his Bible, Margaret replied. Everything since then has just been waiting for the right moment. The church was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. Judge Patterson had agreed to walk Margaret down the aisle, an honor that had made the usually stoic man emotional. As the church doors opened and Margaret saw Daniel waiting at the altar, looking nervous and hopeful and absolutely perfect in his Sunday best, she felt a peace she'd never experienced before. The ceremony was simple but moving. Reverend Morrison spoke about second chances, about beauty rising from ashes, about God's plan being greater than human understanding. When Daniel said his vows, his voice broke slightly on to love and cherish, and Margaret saw several tough ranchers discreetly wiping their eyes. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Morrison declared. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was tender and brief, appropriate for public viewing but promising much more. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the church erupted in celebration. Children threw flower petals, women dabbed at tears, and men whistled and stamped their feet. The reception in the Blackwood Garden was a testament to community effort. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes. Musicians played lively tunes that had people dancing despite the heat. The children performed their songs only slightly off-key, and Margaret laughed through her tears at their enthusiasm. As the sun began to set, Daniel pulled Margaret aside, leading her to a quiet corner of the garden. Happy? He asked, touching her face gently. Beyond words. Good, because I have one more surprise. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a deed to the small building next to the schoolhouse. I bought it from Sam Morrison, Daniel explained. Thought we could convert it into a proper library and study room, somewhere you could expand the school without having to rebuild. Consider it a wedding gift to the teacher who changed our town. Margaret threw her arms around his neck, not caring who saw. You wonderful, thoughtful, perfect man. Far from perfect, but I'm yours, and that's what matters. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Margaret looked around at the faces watching them, her students, their parents, the townspeople who'd become family. A year ago, she'd been Margaret Ellis, abandoned bride with no prospects and no purpose. Now she was Margaret Harper, teacher, wife, integral part of a community that had embraced her when she'd expected rejection. What are you thinking? Daniel asked, spinning her slowly. That Charles Whitmore did me the greatest favor of my life by not showing up that day. Daniel laughed, the sound rich and full. Remind me to thank him if we ever see him again. He's gone to California to find himself. Good for him. And good for us that he left you here to find yourself instead. The stars came out one by one as the celebration continued around them. Margaret thought of Sarah Harper, hoping she approved of how things had turned out. She thought of her parents and brother, wishing they could see her now. She thought of her former self, that desperate woman willing to marry a stranger for security. That woman was gone, transformed by prairie fire and children's laughter, by unexpected love and discovered purpose. In her place stood Margaret Harper, teacher wife, and living proof that sometimes the best life is the one you never planned for. The evening wound down slowly, families drifting home with sleepy children and full hearts. Margaret and Daniel stood on their porch now watching the last wagons disappear into the darkness. "School starts again in 3 months," Margaret said. "I should prepare new lesson plans, order more books, maybe expand the curriculum to include—" Daniel silenced her with a kiss. "Tomorrow," he said against her lips. "Tonight, just be my wife. I can do that." They went inside, closing the door on their first day as husband and wife, ready to begin this new chapter they were writing together. In the distance, a mockingbird sang its complicated song, a melody of borrowed notes that somehow created something entirely new and beautiful. Rather like their life together, Margaret thought. Built from pieces of other stories, other loves, other dreams, but ultimately creating something unique and precious and entirely their own. The house that had been so lonely and quiet for 2 years filled with laughter and conversation. The empty rooms found new purpose. The garden bloomed again, different flowers mixing with the ones Sarah had planted, creating a tapestry of old and new. And every morning, Margaret Harper rose with the sun, kissed her husband goodbye, and walked to the schoolhouse where 27 children waited to learn not just reading and arithmetic, but that life could offer second chances, that strength could rise from sorrow, and that sometimes the very best things came from the very worst beginnings. The abandoned bride had found her home. The grieving widower had found his future. And Clearwater, Texas, that small frontier town where nothing much ever happened, had witnessed a love story that would be told for generations of 2 broken people who chose to build something whole, not in spite of their scars, but because of them. The schoolhouse bell rang clear and true across the prairie, calling children to learn, calling the community together, calling Margaret to her purpose. She answered that call every day with joy, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged. Not as the woman she'd tried to be, but as the woman she'd become. And in the end, that made all the difference.